This happened when I was about 10 years old. My family lived in this old house in a pretty quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing really exciting ever happened. It was the kind of place where you felt safe leaving your doors unlocked, you know? Anyway, one night changed all of that for me, and I still get chills thinking about it. It was a Friday night, and my parents had gone out for dinner, leaving me home with my older sister, Molly. She was 16 at the time, so my parents figured she could handle babysitting me for a few hours while they had their date night. I was parked in front of the TV in the living room, totally absorbed in whatever cartoon I was watching, while Molly was upstairs doing her homework or probably texting her friends. Everything was normal, just a typical night. But then, around 9 p.m., I started hearing this weird noise. At first, it was really faint, like a soft tapping sound coming from somewhere in the house. I didn't think much of it because our house made noises all the time. Old pipes, creaky floors, the usual stuff. But after a while, the tapping got louder, and it didn't sound like the usual house noises anymore. It sounded deliberate, like someone was knocking on something, but not in a normal way. More like testing. I paused the TV and listened for a minute, try to figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought it was maybe the wind outside, but the more I listened, the more I realized it was coming from the back of the house near the kitchen. Feeling uneasy, I got up and walked into the hallway, standing still for a moment to see if I could hear it better. The tapping continued slow and steady. I called out, "Molly, is that you?" No answer. I figured maybe she had come downstairs for a snack or something and was messing around in the kitchen. So I walked down the hall, turned the corner, and peeked into the kitchen. It was empty. The lights were off, and everything was exactly how we'd left it when we finished dinner. But the tapping hadn't stopped. In fact, it was louder now, like it was right outside. I moved closer to the kitchen window, which overlooked our backyard. It was dark out there, and the only light was from a dim porch light my dad had installed years ago, so I couldn't see much. But as I got closer to the window, I felt this strange sense of dread, like something was telling me I really didn't want to see what was out there. I stood there for a second, frozen, before finally getting the courage to look out the window. At first, I didn't see anything. Just our backyard, the old swing set, and the fence that separated our yard from the woods behind our house. But then I saw it, a shadow, moving near the back door. My heart jumped into my throat. It wasn't big, but it was definitely human-shaped. I could barely make it out in the dim light, but it looked like someone crouched down, slowly tapping on the back door like they were testing it to see if it would open. They weren't knocking like someone who wanted to be let in. No, it was more like they were trying to figure out if anyone was home, but didn't want to be heard. I backed away from the window as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. My mind was racing. Who would be out there? We didn't have neighbors that close to us, and nobody ever came to our back door. Something was seriously wrong. I ran upstairs to Molly's room and burst in without knocking. She looked up from her phone, startled. "What's your problem?" "There's someone outside," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. She frowned, clearly not taking me seriously. "You're just imagining things." "No, I'm not. There's someone outside, near the back door." They were tapping on it. Molly sighed, annoyed, but she got up anyway. I could tell she didn't really believe me, but she followed me downstairs. I could still hear the tapping, softer now, like whoever was out there had realized someone was moving inside. Molly peeked out the window, and the moment she did, I saw her whole expression change. She froze, staring out at the dark backyard. "See?" I whispered, my stomach doing flips. She backed away from the window and grabbed her phone. "We need to call Mom and Dad. Now!" I'd never seen her so freaked out, and that's when I knew it wasn't just my imagination. She tried calling my parents, but there was no answer. They must have been somewhere without reception. The tapping had stopped now, but that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made everything worse. Why had it stopped? What was this person doing? Molly turned to me, her voice shaky. "We're gonna lock all the doors and windows, okay? Just stay calm." I followed her around the house as we locked everything up. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside was still there, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Once everything was locked, we sat together in the living room, both of us too scared to do anything but wait for our parents to come home. Molly kept glancing at her phone, hoping they'd call back, but there was nothing. About 20 minutes later, we heard a noise, a loud thud, like something hitting the side of the house. Both of us jumped, and Molly looked at me with wide eyes. "Stay here," she whispered. Before I could protest, she grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the back of the house. I stayed glued to the couch, my heart pounding in my ears, every nerve in my body screaming for her to come back. She disappeared into the hallway, and for what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, suddenly she was back, her face pale. "There's someone out there," she whispered. "By the window." I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed the house phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator picked up, and I stammered out that someone was outside our house, trying to get in. They told us to stay inside, and that help was on the way. Those few minutes waiting for the police felt like hours. We huddled together in the living room, every tiny sound making me jump. Finally, we saw the flashing lights through the front windows, and I've never felt such a rush of relief in my life. The police checked the yard and the woods behind the house, but they didn't find anyone. They said it was probably some creep who saw our house was dark and thought no one was home, but that didn't make me feel any better. Whoever had been out there, tapping on our door, trying to get in. My parents came home a little while later, and they were freaked out too when we told them what happened. After that night, we started locking all the doors and windows, even when we were home. I never felt quite safe in that house again, especially at night. To this day, I have no idea who was out there or what they wanted, but every time I hear a tapping sound, I get that same feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. Some things just stick with you. I never thought I'd end up in a situation like this, but life is funny like that, I guess. It's one of those things that starts out so small you don't even notice it's happening until you're way past the point of no return. So, this happened about 2 years ago. I was 24 and had just gotten out of a long relationship. I wasn't in a great headspace, trying to figure out what the next chapter of my life was supposed to look like. My best friend, Eric, was the only one who really knew what I was going through. We'd been close since high school, practically brothers at this point. I'd known his family just as long, and his mom, Sharon, had always been super kind to me. Sharon was in her early 50s, but honestly, she looked at least a decade younger. She was one of those moms who took good care of herself. Fit, fashionable, always carrying herself with confidence. She wasn't one of those moms who tried to act like she was our age or anything, but she was definitely the type of woman who knew she could still turn heads. To me, though, she'd always been Eric's mom. I never thought of her as anything else. Then one day, that changed. It was summer, and Eric had invited me over for a barbecue at his mom's place. She had this nice house with a pool, so we spent most of the day drinking beers and swimming. Nothing unusual, just a chill day like we'd had 1,000 times before. Eric ended up leaving early because his girlfriend needed a ride to work, but I stayed behind. Sharon said she didn't mind the company, and we kept hanging out by the pool. We talked for a while, mostly about Eric's job and some stuff going on with her work, but eventually the conversation drifted to relationships. I guess it's because she knew I'd just gone through a rough breakup, but Sharon started asking me about my ex, how I was doing, and if I was seeing anyone new. I tried to keep it light, saying I was fine, but she kept pushing, asking if I was lonely. The truth is, I was, but I wasn't about to admit that to my best friend's mom. That's when things started to feel different. At some point during the conversation, Sharon got up to refill our drinks and came back with 2 more beers. She sat down next to me, closer than usual, and handed me a beer, her hand lingering on mine for just a moment longer than necessary. I remember thinking it was weird, but I brushed it off. We'd had a few drinks by that point, and I figured she was just being friendly. But then she said something that caught me completely off guard. "You know," she said, smiling in this way that made my stomach twist, "you've really grown up these past few years. You're not that awkward teenager who used to come over with Eric anymore." I laughed it off, trying to play it cool, but I could feel the tension building between us. There was something in the way she was looking at me that made me feel like this wasn't just friendly banter anymore. And then she touched my arm, just a light, casual touch, but it felt like my entire body tensed up. "I mean it," she continued. "You've turned into a very handsome young man." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was flattered. Here was this attractive older woman complimenting me in a way that felt, well, more than just friendly, But the other part of me was freaking out. This was Eric's mom. There was no way I could let this go any further. But then she leaned in and kissed me. It was like my brain shut off completely. For a split second, I froze, unsure of how to react. Then I kissed her back. I didn't stop it, even though I knew I should have. The whole thing felt surreal, like it wasn't really happening, but it was. We ended up making out by the pool for what felt like forever. And before I knew it, we were inside the house, stumbling toward her bedroom. I'll spare you the details, but it happened. We slept together. I still can't fully explain why I let it happen, but in that moment, everything felt like a blur. It was exciting, forbidden, and I got caught up in the rush of it. The next morning, though, reality came crashing down hard. I woke up in her bed, and the guilt hit me like a freight train. I had just slept with my best friend's mom. What the hell was I thinking? I quietly got dressed, trying not to wake her up, and slipped out of the house as fast as I could. My mind was racing the whole drive home. What if Eric found out? How was I supposed to act normal around him now? I tried to put the whole thing behind me, but it wasn't that simple. Sharon started texting me later that week. At first, it was just small talk. How have you been? Or we should catch up sometime. But then the text got more flirty. She would ask when I was free to come over again, when we could spend some time together without Eric around. I knew I should have shut it down right then. I should have told her it was a mistake, that it couldn't happen again. But I didn't. I kept texting her back, and before long, I was back at her house. We started seeing each other in secret whenever Eric wasn't around. It wasn't just physical, though that was definitely part of it. We'd talk, laugh, and hang out like nothing was wrong, like we weren't breaking every unspoken rule in the book. But every time I left her house, the guilt would come flooding back. I felt like I was living a double life. Eric had no idea, and I was terrified he'd find out. Every time I saw him, I'd feel this pit in my stomach, knowing I was betraying him in the worst possible way. But I couldn't stop. I don't know if it was the thrill of the secrecy or just the fact that I was still reeling from my breakup, but I kept going back. Things blew up a few months later when Eric found one of our text conversations. I still don't know how it happened, but I was over at his place one afternoon, and I guess I left my phone unlocked while I went to the bathroom. When I came back, he was sitting on the couch, looking at my phone, his face completely blank. My stomach dropped. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen, as he scrolled through my texts with his mom. I tried to explain, tried to say it wasn't what it looked like, but there was no talking my way out of it. He was furious. We ended up getting into a huge argument, and he kicked me out of his house. That was the last time I spoke to Eric. He cut me off completely after that, blocked my number, deleted me from all his social media, the whole 9 yards. I don't blame him. I betrayed his trust in the worst way possible, and there's no coming back from that. As for Sharon, we stopped seeing each other after that. The whole thing was too messy, too complicated. I don't know if she ever patched things up with Eric, but I haven't spoken to either of them since. It's been 2 years, and I still feel sick when I think about it. So yeah, that's my story. It's not something I'm proud of, and I know I screwed up big time. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that some lines aren't meant to be crossed, no matter how tempting they might seem in the moment. The fallout just isn't worth it. Trust me on that. This one still makes me laugh and cringe at the same time because it could have gone so wrong, but somehow we all made it out alive and no one got caught. So there was this guy in my grade, Danny, who was like a walking disaster. You know the type, always getting into trouble but somehow avoiding any real consequences. He had this charm, if you could call it that, where even the teachers would just sigh and let him off with a warning because it seemed like too much effort to actually punish him. Anyway, it was our senior year, and Danny decided that we were all too boring and needed to end high school with something legendary. The way he saw it, no one remembered the valedictorian speech or who won the talent show. What people remembered were the stunts, the pranks, the wild stuff that got you talked about at every reunion for years. And Danny? He wanted to be remembered. So, he came up with a plan, a really dumb plan. We had this annual senior tradition where every year, the seniors would pull off a big prank on the last day of school. It was usually something harmless, like putting a bunch of sticky notes all over the principal's office or releasing a bunch of balloons in the hallways. But Danny, he thought that was amateur hour. He wanted to do something epic, something that would make people talk about our class for decades. So, he decided we were going to steal the school's mascot. Now, you might be thinking, that doesn't sound so bad. It's probably just a costume or a statue or something. But no, our school mascot was a live goat. Yeah, a real, breathing goat named Billy, who lived in this little fenced-off area behind the football field. I guess it was supposed to be quirky or traditional or something, but honestly, it was just weird. Still, Billy was kind of a big deal. He showed up at all the games, wore a little school-colored cape, and had his own Instagram account. Yeah, for real. So, naturally, Danny decided that stealing Billy the goat was the only prank worthy of our class. He got a group of us together one night. There were about 6 of us in total, and we snuck onto school grounds after dark. Danny had it all planned out. We'd grab Billy, take him to the beach. Our town wasn't too far from the coast. Get some pictures of him enjoying the senior skip day, and then bring him back before anyone even noticed he was gone. It sounded simple enough, but like most things Danny came up with, it wasn't quite as easy as he made it sound. First off, sneaking into the school grounds wasn't as stealthy as we thought it would be. We thought we'd be like ninjas, but instead, we were a bunch of clumsy high schoolers tripping over ourselves in the dark, trying to hop the fence by the football field. At one point, my friend Jamie got her jeans caught on the top of the fence and just hung there for a minute, screaming while the rest of us tried not to laugh and not to get caught. We eventually managed to pull her down, and by some miracle, we didn't rip her pants or set off any alarms. Once we got to Billy's pen, Danny had this ridiculous idea that we'd just lead the goat out of the enclosure like some kind of goat whisperers. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. As soon as we opened the gate, Billy just bolted. The goat took off across the football field like he was being chased by a pack of wolves, and we all had to sprint after him. Picture 6 high school seniors running like idiots, trying to catch a goat in the middle of the night. It was absolute chaos. Danny was yelling, "Get him! Get him!" like we were in some sort of rodeo. We finally cornered Billy near the bleachers, and Danny, the genius mastermind behind this whole plan, tried to tackle the goat. Yeah, he literally tackled it like it was a linebacker. Of course, Billy wasn't having any of that, so he headbutted Danny square in the stomach. Danny went down hard, clutching his gut and wheezing like he'd just been punched in the lungs, while the rest of us struggled to stop laughing long enough to grab Billy. After a few more failed attempts, we managed to calm Billy down and get him into the back of Danny's van. I know it sounds sketchy as hell, but it was actually a decent setup. Danny had lined the van with blankets and even brought some hay to keep Billy comfortable. The goat didn't seem too thrilled about the whole thing, but he wasn't fighting us anymore, so we figured we were good to go. The plan was to drive Billy to the beach, take some funny photos of him in a pair of sunglasses and a Hawaiian shirt, which yes, we had brought with us, and then bring him back before sunrise. Simple, right? Except things didn't go as smoothly as we hoped. On the way to the beach, we got pulled over. Now, getting pulled over is stressful enough when you've got a car full of teenagers out past curfew. But when you've also got a goat in the back of your van, that's next level panic. Danny was sweating bullets as the cop walked up to the window. I was in the passenger seat, trying to look as innocent as possible, while everyone else in the back was dead silent, hoping Billy wouldn't make any noise. The cop leaned down, took one look inside the van, and said, "You know your back door's open, right?" Yeah, in all the chaos of catching Billy and shoving him into the van, we hadn't even closed the back door properly. We'd been driving around with the door half open, and somehow Billy hadn't made a break for it. Danny played it cool, well, as cool as you can when you've got a goat in the back of your van, and said something like, "Oh, thanks, officer. We'll get that fixed right away." The cop didn't seem too interested in what was going on back there, thankfully, and just told us to be careful and close the door before driving off. We all let out this collective sigh of relief as the cop pulled away. I honestly thought that was it, that we were going to get caught, and the whole prank would be over before it even really started. But somehow, we managed to keep it together, close the door, and get to the beach. Once we were there, things finally started going according to plan. We got Billy out of the van, put the sunglasses and Hawaiian shirt on him, which he surprisingly didn't mind, and took a bunch of ridiculous photos of him chilling by the water. It was one of the dumbest, funniest things I'd ever seen. Here we were, a bunch of high school seniors, standing on the beach at 2 a.m. with a goat in a Hawaiian shirt. We even got some shots of him surfing on a boogie board, though he mostly just stood there looking confused. After about an hour of messing around, we decided it was time to take Billy back. We loaded him up, drove back to school, and somehow managed to get him back into his pen without any more incidents. It was almost too perfect, like the universe was cutting us some slack for once. I never thought I'd be one of those people writing about their cheating ex on the internet, but here I am. It's still a little raw, but maybe sharing this will help me put the pieces together, or at least help someone else see the signs I missed. We were together for almost 4 years. It wasn't perfect, but it was good, solid, or so I thought. We met at a party thrown by mutual friends, and he had this way of making me laugh so hard that I couldn't breathe. We clicked right away. We moved in together after a year, and I honestly thought he was the one. We even talked about getting married someday, maybe even starting a family. You know, all the things you dream about when you think you found your person. The first sign that something was off was small, so small I brushed it off without a second thought. He'd always been a little protective of his phone, but it wasn't anything major. We both had our privacy, and that was fine. But one night, we were lying in bed, and his phone buzzed with a text. I wasn't snooping or anything, just lying there. He grabbed it so fast that it startled me, like he was worried I'd see something I shouldn't. I joked about it, something like, "Wow, got something to hide?" He laughed it off, said it was just work, but he didn't let go of his phone for the rest of the night. It felt weird, but I shrugged it off. Everyone's entitled to some privacy, right? A few weeks later, the late nights at work started. He had a stressful job in finance. I didn't think much of it when he said he had to stay late to finish up some reports or meet with clients. It wasn't unusual for him to work long hours, but suddenly it became an almost nightly thing. "I'll be home late," he'd text me. "Don't wait up." At first, I felt bad for him, thinking he was just exhausted and overwhelmed. I'd leave dinner in the fridge for him, maybe a note telling him I loved him, trying to be supportive. But the late nights turned into something else. He stopped coming home at all on some nights. He'd say he was crashing at a friend's place because it was closer to the office, or that they'd had a few drinks and he didn't want to drive. It happened maybe once or twice a month at first, but then it became more frequent. Again, I didn't think too much of it. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? Then there was the change in his appearance. Now, this guy had never been overly concerned with how he looked. I mean, he had style, sure, but he wasn't the type to spend hours in front of the mirror. But all of a sudden, he was new clothes, new cologne, stuff he'd never cared about before. He even started hitting the gym more often, which again, I thought was a good thing. I was happy he was taking care of himself. But looking back, he wasn't doing it for me. He was doing it for someone else. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. He said he was going to meet up with some friends to watch a game, but something in my gut told me to check his location. I had never done anything like that before, and honestly, I felt kind of gross about it. But something just didn't feel right. When I looked, he wasn't at the bar where he said he'd be. His location was somewhere I didn't recognize, in a completely different part of town. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe they'd changed venues, or maybe he was grabbing food somewhere before meeting up with them. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But then, a few hours later, he texted me a picture of him and his friends at the bar. My stomach dropped. I knew that picture wasn't taken in real time. I didn't say anything right away. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was being paranoid. The real blow came the next day. I was doing laundry, something I'd done 1,000 times before, and I found a receipt in his pocket. It was for a hotel room, dated the night before. My blood ran cold. I sat there on the floor of our bedroom, holding that receipt like it was a bomb that had just gone off in my life. There was no way to explain it away. There was no reason for him to be staying in a hotel unless he was with someone else. I confronted him that night. I couldn't hold it in any longer. When he walked through the door, I asked him straight up, "Who were you with last night?" He looked confused at first, like he hadn't heard me right. I held up the receipt, and his face went white. He didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, he said, "It's not what you think. Isn't that what they always say?" I asked him again, and this time he broke down. He admitted it. There was someone else. He'd been seeing her for almost 6 months. 6 months of lies. 6 months of me thinking everything was fine while he was out with her, doing God knows what. The worst part? I knew her. She was a co-worker of his, someone I'd met at his office holiday party the year before. She'd smiled at me, shaken my hand, complimented my dress, all while sleeping with my boyfriend behind my back. I felt like my entire world had collapsed in that moment. I didn't even cry, not at first. I just stood there, numb, staring at him as he tried to explain himself. He said it wasn't serious, that it was just a fling, that he still loved me, and that it didn't mean anything. But how could it not mean anything? He'd lied to me every single day for months. He let me go on believing we had a future together while he was building something with her. I told him to pack his things and leave. There was no yelling, no screaming, just cold, dead silence. He tried to apologize, to tell me he didn't want to lose me, but I couldn't even look at him. The man I thought I knew, the man I'd shared my life with, had been a stranger all along. In the weeks that followed, I went through every possible emotion: anger, sadness, disbelief. I replayed every moment, every sign I'd missed, wondering how I could have been so blind. The late nights, the secrecy, the defensiveness, it all made sense now. But in the moment, when you're in love with someone, you don't want to see the truth. You want to believe the person you love would never hurt you like that. I haven't spoken to him since the day he left. He tried reaching out a few times, but I blocked him. I don't need closure from someone who betrayed me so completely. The only closure I need is knowing that I'm better off without him. Looking back, the signs were there, clear as day. The phone's secrecy, the sudden change in appearance, the late nights, it was all there, but I didn't want to believe it. I guess when you love someone, you ignore the things that don't add up because you don't want to face the possibility that the person you trust the most is lying to you. If I've learned anything from this experience, it's to trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And if someone's hiding things from you, even if it seems small or insignificant at first, don't ignore it. People don't hide things unless they have something to hide. I've always been a cautious guy, never took unnecessary risks, never drove too fast, and always wore my seatbelt. I thought I had life pretty well figured out in terms of avoiding danger. But what almost killed me wasn't a car crash, a fall, or anything like that. It was cherry pits. Yeah, those little harmless-looking things nearly sent me to the afterlife. It was a family barbecue, one of those laid-back summer evenings where you sit around a fire pit, drink too many beers, and eat way too much food. My mom had this huge bowl of fresh cherries out on the table, right next to the chips and salsa. I'd been munching on them for hours, casually spitting the pits into a little plastic cup like it was no big deal. After all, cherries are healthy, right? Now let me explain something. I've always had this weird habit of cracking cherry pits between my teeth. I know it's gross, and yes, my dentist hates me. But I'd been doing it for years without thinking twice about it. It's not like I was swallowing them. I just crunch down, crack them, and spit them out. No harm, no fault. Except this time I did something incredibly stupid. I don't know if it was the beer, the distraction of conversation, or just my brain completely short-circuiting, but I bit down on one of those pits a little too hard. It didn't crack like usual. Instead, it slipped right out from between my teeth and shot straight to the back of my throat. 1 second I was laughing at something my brother said. The next I was choking on a cherry pit. And when I say choking, I mean full-on, can't breathe, something is blocking my windpipe kind of choking. Now, choking is one of those things you don't really understand until it happens to you. You think, oh, I'll just cough it up, or someone will give me the Heimlich and it'll all be fine. But in that moment, when your body is panicking and your brain is screaming at you that you can't get air, it's pure terror. I tried to cough, but nothing was happening. My throat was completely blocked. I could feel the cherry pit lodged in there, like a boulder in a tiny creek, and no matter how hard I hacked, it wasn't budging. My eyes started watering, and my vision got all hazy. That's when the real fear hit. I might die right here at a family barbecue because of a damn cherry pit. I stood up, clutching my throat, trying to signal to my family that I was in serious trouble. At first, they thought I was joking. I guess I didn't look panicked enough yet. But after a few seconds of me flailing and not making a sound, their faces went from, haha, very funny, to sheer panic. My mom jumped up first, yelling for my dad, who ran over and tried to give me the Heimlich. Let me tell you, the Heimlich is not as easy or glamorous as they make it look on TV. My dad's a big guy, and when he squeezed my stomach, it felt like my ribs were about to snap. I could feel my entire body lurching forward with each thrust, but the cherry pit still stuck. At this point, I'm thinking, this is it. This is how I go. Choking to death at a barbecue while my dad breaks my ribs. Everything was starting to blur, and I could hear this weird ringing in my ears. It's strange, the thoughts that go through your head when you think you're about to die. Mine were all over the place, like who's going to finish the report I've been working on at my job? Will they serve food at my funeral? Will people remember to tell this story and laugh about how ridiculous it was that I went out like this? But then, just when things were getting seriously dark, my dad gave one last, desperate Heimlich thrust, and I felt the pit pop out of my throat. It flew across the yard like a little projectile, landing in the grass with a soft thud. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my lungs burning like they were on fire. It took me a few minutes to catch my breath, and when I finally stood up, everyone was just staring at me, eyes wide, completely freaked out. I laughed it off like, well, that was fun, but inside I was shaking. I'd never come that close to death before, and it wasn't some big, dramatic event. It was a tiny, stupid cherry pit that nearly ended me. After that, I swore off cracking cherry pits with my teeth. Hell, I stopped eating cherries altogether for a while. The whole thing freaked me out so much that I couldn't even look at them without feeling that tightness in my throat again. And I definitely learned my lesson. Never underestimate how quickly something can go wrong. Here's the thing. Choking is one of those everyday dangers that nobody really talks about until it happens. We think about car accidents, plane crashes, even lightning strikes. But the truth is you can be taken out in seconds by something as small as a piece of food. I looked it up later and found out that choking is one of the leading causes of accidental deaths. And it happens more often than you'd think. People choke on food, small objects, you name it, and sometimes there's no one around to help, or the help doesn't come fast enough. I was lucky. My dad was right there, knew what to do, and didn't give up until the pit was out. But I'll never forget how close I came to dying that day over something so stupid. It's a humbling experience, realizing how fragile we really are. 1 second you're fine, and the next you're gasping for air on the edge of unconsciousness because of a tiny piece of fruit. So, next time you're eating something, especially something with pits or seeds, be careful. Don't get lazy or careless like I did. And if you ever see someone choking, don't hesitate. Do the Heimlich, call for help, whatever it takes, because those few seconds can mean the difference between life and death. And for the love of all things good, stop cracking cherry pits with your teeth. Seriously. This isn't something I ever thought I'd share, but after reading through other people's stories, I feel like maybe getting it off my chest will help. I still feel conflicted about it. But here we go. It happened a couple of years ago, just after I turned 23. My friend Ethan and I had known each other since middle school, and by the time we hit our 20s, we were as close as brothers. His house was like my second home growing up, and his mom, Linda, was always super welcoming. She was one of those moms who always made sure everyone had something to eat, made conversation with all of Ethan's friends, and was just genuinely cool to be around. She had this kind of warm energy, friendly, but never overbearing. And yeah, she was attractive. Linda was in her late 40s, but she looked much younger. She took care of herself, worked out regularly, and had that classic hot mom vibe that we all noticed in high school, though nobody dared to talk about it. To us, she was Ethan's mom and nothing more. Then, one summer, everything changed. Ethan had moved out of his parents' place to live with his girlfriend, so it was just Linda and her husband at home. Except her husband, Gary, was away for work a lot. He worked in construction management and would sometimes be gone for weeks at a time. I didn't think much of it until one night, when Ethan invited me over for a barbecue they were having. He couldn't make it at the last minute because his girlfriend had an emergency, but Linda insisted I still come over. I showed up, expecting it to be awkward without Ethan there, but Linda was in a great mood. We sat in the backyard, grilled some steaks, and drank a couple of beers. She was in this casual sundress, barefoot, and it didn't feel like I was hanging out with a friend's mom anymore. It felt different, more relaxed, almost like we were equals. The conversation was easy, mostly about Ethan and work, and before I knew it, we'd moved inside where she opened a bottle of wine. We sat at the kitchen table, and I was trying to play it cool, but I couldn't help noticing how good she looked. We kept drinking, and soon enough, we started talking about deeper stuff. Her marriage, how she felt lonely with Gary being away so much, and how different life was now that both her kids had moved out. At some point, She stood up to get more wine, but instead of going to the kitchen, she paused behind my chair. She put her hands on my shoulders and gave me this long, thoughtful look in the reflection of the window. It was like time froze. The room felt smaller, quieter, and I could feel the shift in the air. "You're a good guy," she said softly. "It's nice having someone to talk to." Her hands lingered on my shoulders for just a moment longer than they should have, and that's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. Something was happening, and I had no idea how to handle it. I should have left right then. I knew it. My brain was screaming at me to make an excuse and get out of there, but instead, I stayed. I didn't want to misread the situation, but part of me didn't want to stop whatever this was becoming. After she sat back down, there was this charged silence between us. Then she leaned forward closer than before and said, "You know, I've been feeling different lately." She smiled, but it wasn't the friendly mom smile I'd always known. This was something else entirely. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. I was buzzed, but not drunk enough to ignore how wrong this was. Still, I didn't stop it. I don't even know why. I guess part of me was curious, and another part of me was flattered, if I'm being honest. Here was this beautiful woman showing interest in me, and it was hard not to get caught up in that. Then she made the first move. "I'm probably being ridiculous," she said, almost like she was testing the waters. She stood up again, walked over to me, and placed her hand on my arm. I froze, but I didn't pull away. "But would you think less of me if I told you I haven't felt this kind of connection in a long time?" Before I could even respond, she leaned down and kissed me. I didn't stop her. I kissed her back. My mind was a mess, part of me screaming that this was Ethan's mom, that I had to end it right there, but another part of me completely overwhelmed by how surreal the whole situation was. Things escalated quickly. We didn't even make it to her bedroom. We ended up on the living room couch, and before I knew it, we were tangled up in each other. It was impulsive, wild, and I wasn't thinking about the consequences in that moment. Everything else just faded away. Afterward, I sat there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. Linda didn't seem fazed. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "I hope this doesn't make things weird between us." But how could it not? I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I mumbled something about needing to head home, and I left. The next day, I felt sick. The guilt hit me like a ton of bricks. Ethan and I were supposed to meet up that afternoon, and I could barely look him in the eye. I kept wondering if he could tell if there was some weird vibe between us now. But he didn't notice anything, just laughed and talked like everything was normal. I thought that would be the end of it, that it was just a one-time, drunken mistake. But then Linda started texting me. At first, it was harmless, checking in, asking how I was doing, but then the text started becoming more flirty, more suggestive. She'd asked me to come over when Gary was out of town, saying she could use the company. And like an idiot, I went. We hooked up again and again. It became this secret thing between us, and every time I told myself it was the last time, that I'd stop, I'd end up right back at her house. I was addicted to the thrill, the secrecy. I knew it was wrong, that I was betraying Ethan in the worst possible way, but I couldn't stop myself. Things came crashing down about 4 months later. Ethan came home one day when I was at his place, and Linda and I were in the middle of, well, you know, we weren't exactly being discreet, and he walked in on us in the living room. The look on his face was pure shock, and I'll never forget the anger that followed. He didn't say anything at first, just stormed out of the house. I tried to follow him, tried to apologize, but what could I possibly say? I'd slept with his mom for months behind his back. We were done. He cut me off completely after that, blocked me on everything, wouldn't respond to my calls or texts. And honestly, I don't blame him. Linda and I stopped seeing each other after that. The whole thing just fell apart, and I haven't spoken to her or Ethan since. I don't know if they ever patched things up, but I doubt it. The guilt still eats at me sometimes, especially when I think about how easily I let it all happen. So yeah, that's my story. It's a mess, and I know I'm the bad guy in this situation. I lost my best friend because I couldn't control myself, and now I have to live with that. If there's one thing I learned, it's that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how tempting they seem in the moment. It's just not worth the fallout. Back when I was in high school, I had this best friend, Josh. We were inseparable, always getting into trouble together, pulling pranks, sneaking out, you name it. So when Josh invited me to spend a weekend at his family's cabin in the woods, I was all in. His parents owned this old, rundown place deep in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and apparently, they hadn't used it in years. To us, it sounded perfect. No adults, no neighbors, just two teenage guys with a whole forest to ourselves. We drove up on a Friday after school, blasting music the whole way there, excited about a weekend of fishing, hiking, and probably a little drinking, thanks to Josh's borrowed supply from his dad's liquor cabinet. The place was even more isolated than I'd imagined. No cell service, no electricity except for this ancient generator that barely worked, and no one around for miles. At the time, it seemed like the ultimate adventure. The cabin itself was creepy, though. It was small, just a single room with an old stone fireplace and a couple of saga bunk beds. There was dust everywhere, and it smelled like damp wood and mold, like it had been sitting untouched for way too long. But we didn't care. We dropped our bags, threw together a fire in the hearth, and settled in for what we thought was going to be an awesome weekend. That first night, everything was fine. We stayed up late, playing cards and talking about girls, laughing about stupid stuff like we always did. But sometime after midnight, I started getting this weird feeling. You know when everything around you is calm, but you just can't shake the sense that something's off? It was like that, like there was something just outside the cabin, watching us. I didn't say anything at first, because I didn't want to look like a wimp in front of Josh. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint noise like something moving through the trees just beyond the clearing where the cabin sat. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but the more I listened, the more it sounded wrong. Like whatever it wasn't just passing through. It was pacing. "Josh, you hear that?" I finally asked, keeping my voice low. He paused, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, probably just a deer, man." But I could tell he didn't really believe that. We sat there for a while, both of us straining to hear, the fire crackling softly in the background. The noise came again, closer this time. Heavy footsteps like something big was walking around just outside. "Deer don't sound like that," I whispered. Josh stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Probably a bear or something," he said, but his voice didn't have its usual confidence. I got up and joined him at the window, staring out into the blackness. The moon was barely out, casting just enough light to make out the tree line, but beyond that, it was pitch dark. We couldn't see anything, but the footsteps continued, circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. "I think we should go check it out," Josh said, trying to act brave, but I could hear the unease in his voice. "No way," I shot back, shaking my head. "Let's just stay inside." For a minute, we stood there frozen, listening as the sound seemed to come closer, stopping just outside the front door. Then, without warning, there was a loud thump, like something had hit the side of the cabin, hard. Both of us jumped, and Josh swore under his breath. What the hell was that? I didn't know, but every instinct I had was screaming that we needed to stay inside, keep the door locked, and not go anywhere near whatever was out there. But Josh, being Josh, wasn't having it. Before I could stop him, he grabbed the flashlight off the table and threw open the door. I wanted to yell at him to close it, but the words caught in my throat as I watched him step out onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I stayed by the door, clutching the handle like it was a lifeline, every muscle in my body tense. "What do you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Josh swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees, the ground, everywhere, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no eyes glowing in the light. Just the quiet woods, as if whatever had been out there had vanished the moment he stepped outside. He stood there for a few seconds longer, then shrugged. "Told you, probably just an animal." He tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. He stepped back inside, and I quickly slammed the door behind him, bolting it shut. We sat back down by the fire, neither of us saying much, but I could tell we were both on edge. I don't know how long we sat there, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the heavy silence that had settled over the cabin. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of something scratching against the outside wall. My eyes snapped open, heart racing. As the scratching continued, this slow, deliberate scraping sound like nails dragging across the wood. I glanced over at Josh, who was already sitting up, wide-eyed and alert. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, barely able to breathe. "I don't know," he muttered, grabbing the flashlight again. We sat there, listening as the scratching moved from one side of the cabin to the other, like it was circling us, testing the walls. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on us like a weight. "We need to get out of here," Josh said quietly, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. We grabbed our stuff, just the essentials, and slipped out the back door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The air outside was still and cold, and the trees loomed over us like silent sentinels. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, or that scratching, but the only sound was our own hurried breathing. We made it to Josh's car and piled in, hearts pounding, glancing around like we expected something to come out of the woods after us. He fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start, and we peeled out of there like our lives depended on it. The whole drive back, we didn't say a word. Both of us were too rattled to talk about what had just happened. It wasn't until we were halfway back to civilization, the sun starting to rise, that Josh finally spoke. "I don't know what that was, man, but I'm not going back." I didn't argue with him. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't just some animal, and it wasn't something I ever wanted to encounter again. To this day, I still think about that night. The way the forest went dead quiet, the footsteps, the scratching. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that we listened to our gut, and thank God we did. A few years ago, I did something that still haunts me every single day. It was an accident, but it changed someone's life forever. And I've never told anyone, not my family, not my friends, not even the person involved. I don't think I ever will. This secret is going to the grave with me. It all started when I was working at this small marketing agency. I wasn't exactly happy there, but the pay was decent, and I was trying to stick it out while I figured out what I really wanted to do. We had this team of about 10 people, and for the most part, everyone got along pretty well. Except for this one guy. Let's call him Dan. Dan was a bit of an oddball. He was quiet, kept to himself, and always seemed a little on edge. Some people in the office made fun of him behind his back, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't join in sometimes. We weren't mean per se, but we'd joke about how intense he could be or how he never seemed to smile. One afternoon, I was alone in the office. Everyone had left early for some team-building event I didn't feel like going to, so I stayed behind to catch up on work. Dan was also still there, working in his usual corner. I remember thinking it was weird how he never seemed to join in on any of the social stuff, but I figured he was just one of those lone wolf types. Anyway, I was bored, so I decided to poke around on my computer. I opened up the company's shared drive, which had all sorts of random files on it. I wasn't really looking for anything in particular, just snooping around because I didn't feel like doing actual work. That's when I found it, a folder with Dan's name on it. It was just sitting there in plain sight, not even password protected. Out of sheer curiosity and, boredom, I clicked on it. I figured it was just work stuff, documents, presentations, maybe some spreadsheets. But I was wrong. Inside the folder were personal files. Really personal. There were old resumes, a few personal photos, and then something that made my stomach drop. There was a video file, titled simply with a date. I know I should have stopped right there, but I didn't. I clicked on it. The video was of Dan, sitting in what looked like his bedroom, recording himself on his laptop camera. He looked different. Not the tense, uptight guy we knew at work. He looked vulnerable, scared, like he was on the verge of breaking down. He started talking. I can't remember everything he said verbatim, but the gist of it was this. Dan was struggling. Badly. He talked about how he felt like he didn't belong anywhere, how he was invisible, how every day felt like a battle just to keep going. He said he didn't think anyone at work liked him, that he could feel people judging him, laughing at him behind his back. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I don't think I can do this anymore." My heart stopped. Was I watching a suicide note? I felt sick. I shouldn't have been watching this. This wasn't meant for anyone else's eyes, especially not mine. But instead of closing the file, I just sat there, frozen, watching as Dan poured his heart out to the camera. He ended the video by saying he didn't know how much longer he could keep up the act and that he was thinking of ending it all. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to rush over to his desk and tell him I was there for him, that he wasn't invisible, that we'd all been wrong about him. But the other part of me, the cowardly part, was too ashamed. Ashamed that I had invaded his privacy. Ashamed that I'd laughed at him behind his back. And ashamed that I wasn't the kind of person who could have been a friend to him when he needed one. So I did nothing. I deleted the video from the shared drive, hoping that if I erased it, I could pretend I'd never seen it. I figured that maybe, just maybe, this was an old video, something he recorded in a dark moment but had moved past. Maybe he was doing better now. Maybe it was just a temporary cry for help, and he didn't actually mean it. For the next few weeks, I kept a closer eye on Dan. He still seemed quiet, still kept to himself, but nothing seemed off. He showed up to work on time, did his job, and left like usual. I convinced myself that he was fine, that I didn't need to do anything. It was easier that way to just let it go. But then one day, Dan didn't show up to work. No one thought much of it at first. People called in sick all the time. But when he didn't show up the next day, and the day after that, people started to worry. HR tried calling him, but there was no answer. Eventually, they called the police for a welfare check. Dan was found dead in his apartment. He'd taken his own life. The news hit the office like a bomb. Everyone was shocked, sad, confused. People who'd barely spoken to him started talking about how they wished they'd gotten to know him better, how they'd noticed he seemed off, but hadn't said anything. It was all bullshit. None of us really knew him, and now it was too late. I've never told anyone about the video I saw. I don't know if it was recent, if it was recorded right before he died, or if it was an old cry for help. But I think about it all the time. I think about how I could have done something, anything to help him. I could have reached out, talked to him, told him I saw the video and that he wasn't alone. But I didn't. I was too scared, too ashamed, too selfish to admit I'd been wrong about him. I don't know if my speaking up would have changed anything. Maybe Dan had already made up his mind, and nothing I could have said would have stopped him. But I'll never know, and that uncertainty haunts me every day. I live with the guilt of knowing that I had a chance to help someone and I didn't take it. I'll always wonder if things could have been different. So yeah, that's my secret. I watched someone's final cry for help, and I did nothing. I used to think conspiracy theories were just fun little stories people made up to entertain themselves, but then I came across something that truly unsettled me. It wasn't some far-fetched idea like lizard people running the government or the moon being hollow. It was something much closer to home. It started with a small, simple question. What if history as we know it has been rewritten? I'm not talking about historical events being interpreted differently or new evidence coming to light. I'm talking about entire eras of history being erased or invented. There's a theory, one that I stumbled across late one night while diving too deep into random internet forums, that suggests that some of the history we were taught never actually happened. Specifically, it revolves around a time period called the phantom time hypothesis. I know it sounds crazy. At first I thought so too. But as I kept reading, the more I started to wonder, what if there's some truth to it? The phantom time hypothesis suggests that around 300 years of history between the 8th and 11th centuries didn't actually happen. According to this theory, these years were fabricated by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. The reason? To place their reign in the year 1000 AD, which was seen as a millennial milestone. In other words, we are not living in the year 2024, but somewhere closer to 1724, and everything we think we know about that chunk of history. Charlemagne, the rise of feudalism, even some key events of the Middle Ages was essentially made up. The idea was so bizarre, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who would go to such lengths to fake centuries of history? And how would you even pull that off? As I started digging deeper, I found that a few of the pieces actually seemed to fit in unsettling ways. First of all, there's the lack of archaeological evidence from that period. You'd think with 3 centuries worth of human civilization, we'd have mountains of artifacts and structures to show for it, right? But according to some sources, there's a curious gap. A lot of buildings and documents from the early Middle Ages are either non-existent or later proven to be forgeries. It's almost like someone tried to piece together a puzzle of that time period, but didn't have all the pieces. I brushed it off as coincidence at first, but the more I read, the more examples I found. Then there's the calendar issue. Ever wondered why our calendar doesn't quite line up with the actual time it takes the Earth to orbit the Sun? Over time, The discrepancy added up to around 10 days by the time Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582. His solution was to just drop 10 days from the calendar to correct the drift, but the phantom time theorists claim that instead of just 10 days, entire centuries were added or erased during previous reforms, especially under Charlemagne and the popes. It's weird, right? But what really got under my skin was the idea that this wasn't just an innocent mistake or oversight. The theory goes deeper, suggesting that it was a deliberate effort to consolidate power. By rewriting history, Otto III, the Pope, and others created a version of reality that suited their needs, wiping out troublesome events or rulers from the record and inserting themselves as key figures at the right time. They could control how people thought of the past, and in doing so, shape the present and future. I found myself looking at history books differently after that. Who's to say what's true and what's fabricated? We rely on ancient texts, on artifacts, on traditions passed down through the ages, but how do we know that those weren't tampered with at some point? It's like that game of telephone we all played as kids. The message starts clear, but by the time it's passed through a few dozen people, it's completely distorted. What if history is just one giant game of telephone, but with intentional distortions? I couldn't stop thinking about it. For weeks, I dove deeper into the idea, watching YouTube videos, reading articles, and even checking out a few books on historical revisionism. Most mainstream historians reject the phantom time hypothesis, of course. They say there's overwhelming evidence to support the events of those centuries, and they dismiss the gaps as being due to the chaos and disorganization of the early Middle Ages. But once the idea is planted in your mind, it's hard to shake. What if those gaps are there because there's no real history to fill them? I'm not saying I believe it 100%, but there are moments when I look at history with fresh eyes, and I wonder, what if we've been living in a world built on a lie? What if everything we think we know about the past has been curated, edited, or worse, fabricated? It's terrifying, because if the past can be rewritten, what's to stop people from doing the same with the present? How much of what we're seeing now is real? Or is it just another carefully constructed narrative designed to control the way we think and act? I can't prove any of this, of course. I'm just an ordinary person trying to make sense of the world. But every now and then, when I look at a history textbook or read about some ancient event, a part of me wonders, how much of this actually happened? That's what scares me the most. The idea that we may never know the truth. We could be living in a version of history that was written by a few powerful people with their own agendas, and we're just the unsuspecting characters in their story. So yeah, that's the scariest conspiracy theory I've ever heard, and the one I can't quite shake from my mind. Alright, I never thought I'd be sharing this, but here goes. My first day in the industry? Absolute chaos. I'm talking, what the hell have I gotten myself into levels of panic? To set the scene, I was 24, fresh out of a really bad breakup and drowning in student loans. I'd graduated with a degree that promised me plenty of job opportunities, but no one tells you how useless that is without experience. So, here I was broke, newly single, and stressed out about bills. A friend, let's call her Sarah, had been stripping for about a year by then, and she swore it was the best decision she'd ever made. She'd talk about how much money she was pulling in and how it gave her the flexibility to work when she wanted. She'd also said it helped her regain some confidence after going through her own rough patch. I wasn't convinced at first, but I'd always admired how she just didn't seem to give a damn what anyone thought. She owned her decisions. One night, we were having drinks, and she finally convinced me to at least go in and talk to the manager at the club she worked at. I didn't really know what to expect, but I figured the worst that could happen was that they'd tell me no, right? So, I set up a meeting with the manager for a Saturday afternoon. When I walked into the club, it was empty except for a few girls practicing their routines on the stage. The club had this weird vibe during the day, almost like a regular bar, but with poles and neon lights that hadn't been turned on yet. The manager, a big guy with a bald head and a permanent scowl, sat me down in his office, which was basically just a small, cluttered room with a desk and a giant bottle of Jack Daniels sitting on top of it. "So, you want to dance?" he asked, barely looking up from his phone. I was so nervous I could barely get the words out. Yeah, I guess." He gave me a once-over, then leaned back in his chair and said, "You ever done this before?" "No," I admitted, feeling like I had already blown my shot. He shrugged. Doesn't matter. Everyone starts somewhere. Then he gave me the rundown of the house fees, the rules, and how to make money. Basically, I was on my own. No hourly pay, just whatever I could hustle from tips and lap dances. It sounded terrifying, but I nodded like I understood. He told me I could start that night if I wanted. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but he didn't seem to care. You either do it, or you don't. No big deal, he said. I left the club in a daze, wondering what I had just signed up for. I called Sarah and told her what had happened. She laughed and said, "Girl, you're going to be fine. I'll be there tonight to help you through it." That made me feel a little better, but I was still freaking out. So, that night, I put on my only sexy outfit, which was just a tight dress I'd worn to a party a few years ago, and headed back to the club. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting at the bar, casually sipping a drink like she'd been doing this her whole life. She took one look at me and said, "Oh no, babe. That dress won't do. Come with me." She dragged me to the dressing room, where she helped me pick out something a little more appropriate. Let's just say there was a lot less fabric involved. She even lent me a pair of heels, which I was absolutely not prepared for. I don't know how anyone walks in those things, let alone dances in them. I felt like a complete imposter standing there in front of the mirror, trying to hype myself up. I was too self-conscious about everything. How I looked, how I moved, whether I was going to trip over my own feet in front of a crowd of people. Sarah noticed and gave me a reassuring smile. "Relax, it's just like performing at a club. Only you get paid." Easy for her to say. When the time came for me to take the stage, I could feel my heart racing. The lights were blinding, the music was loud, and the whole room suddenly felt a lot smaller. I grabbed onto the pole like it was a lifeline, praying I wouldn't fall flat on my face. My first few steps were awkward. I was too stiff, too nervous. I kept thinking, everyone's watching. Don't screw up. Don't fall. But then something strange happened. About halfway through the song, I realized nobody was judging me the way I thought they would. Some guys were just mindlessly staring. Others were barely paying attention. They were just there to have a good time, not to critique my every move. That was the moment I started to loosen up a bit. I stopped worrying about how I looked and just moved with the music, trying to have fun with it. I even managed to do a little spin around the pole without making a fool of myself. Small victories. By the end of the night, I had made about $100 in tips. It wasn't a lot, but it was more than I had made in a single shift at any of my previous jobs. The rush of having actual cash in my hand after just a few hours of work was surreal. Sarah came over and gave me a hug. "See? Not so bad, right?" I smiled, feeling a weird mix of pride and exhaustion. I guess not. That was the start of a roller coaster I wasn't fully prepared for. Some nights were great. I'd make more money than I'd ever thought possible and leave the club feeling like I had everything under control. Other nights were brutal, drunk customers who were way too handsy, bachelorette parties that were a nightmare to deal with, and moments where I seriously questioned what I was doing with my life. There were even a few times I had to remind myself that this was temporary, that I wasn't going to do this forever. But the weird thing is, I actually started to get better at it. I wasn't the best dancer, not by a long shot, but I learned how to work the room. I learned that most of the guys just wanted someone to pay attention to them, to listen to their stories or make them feel special for a little while. It wasn't just about shaking your ass for tips. It was a whole performance, a game of psychology. Once I figured that out, it became easier. The money started rolling in more consistently, and I got better at setting boundaries with customers too. You develop a thick skin pretty quickly in this line of work. I ended up dancing for almost 2 years before I decided it was time to move on. By then, I'd paid off a good chunk of my debt, saved up a bit, and even started taking some classes to get my career back on track. When I finally quit, I felt like I was closing a chapter on a crazy part of my life. Looking back, I don't regret it. It was tough, sure, but it also gave me a kind of confidence I didn't know I had. I learned how to handle myself in situations that used to make me freeze up. And honestly, there's something empowering about knowing you can walk into a room, command attention, and leave with more cash than you started with. It's not for everyone, but it got me through a rough patch, and I came out the other side stronger for it. I was in my early 30s, fresh out of a long-term relationship that had ended amicably. Or so I thought. I wasn't looking for anything serious at the time, just trying to focus on myself. But then he came along. He was charming, funny, and made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. It didn't take long before we were spending nearly every day together, and it felt like I'd found someone who truly understood me. We clicked, and for the first year, everything was great, almost too great. The first sign that things weren't what they seemed came in the form of small, subtle changes. Nothing major, at least not at first. We'd always been open with each other about our phones, checking each other's playlists, showing off funny memes, that sort of thing. But one day, he started putting his phone on silent. It wasn't a big deal at first. Everyone needs a little peace and quiet sometimes, right? But then it became an all-the-time thing. I'd hear a buzz, and he'd glance at the screen, but wouldn't respond. Or worse, he'd pick it up, glance at it, and then immediately lock it without saying a word. It was odd, but I didn't want to be that person who interrogates their partner about every little thing. I let it go, but the behavior continued. He started taking his phone everywhere with him, even into the bathroom. There was one time we were out for dinner with friends, and he excused himself to take a call. I figured it was work-related. He was in a demanding job after all, but when I asked him about it later, he got defensive. "Why do you care? It was just a quick call," he snapped. That's when I knew something wasn't right. He'd never spoken to me like that before. Still, I convinced myself I was overthinking it. A few weeks later, things escalated. He started coming home later and later from work. At first, it was just an extra hour here or there. Then it became whole evenings where he'd say he was working late or grabbing drinks with colleagues. It wasn't like him. Before, we'd always text throughout the day, check in with each other, even if it was just to say, "Hey, how's your day going?" But now his responses were shorter, more vague, like he didn't really want to talk. I'd ask him about his day, and he'd shrug it off or say he was too tired to get into it. The distance was growing, but I didn't want to confront it. Then came the grooming. Now, don't get me wrong, I loved when he dressed up. He always looked great, but suddenly, it was every day. New clothes, expensive cologne, a fresh haircut every couple of weeks. Stuff he never used to care about. He'd leave for work looking like he was going to a red carpet event. I joked about it at first, saying he was putting me to shame with how good he looked. But deep down, I knew he wasn't dressing up for me. One night, we were supposed to have a date night, but he canceled last minute, claiming he was exhausted from work. I was disappointed, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. So, I decided to surprise him at home with his favorite takeout. I pulled up outside his place and saw his car in the driveway, lights off inside. As I was about to knock on the door, I saw a figure in the distance. He wasn't alone. He was walking down the street with a woman I didn't recognize, laughing and smiling in a way I hadn't seen him do with me in months. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart was racing, my palms sweating. I didn't know whether to confront him or just walk away. In that moment, I felt like my entire world was crumbling. Instead of making a scene, I drove home in silence, numb to everything around me. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, that maybe I was jumping to conclusions. But deep down, I knew the truth. The next day, I confronted him. I asked him about the woman, asked why he lied to me about working late when he was clearly with someone else. His reaction was ice cold. He didn't apologize, didn't try to explain. Instead, he turned it around on me. "Why are you spying on me?" he said. "I don't need to explain myself to you. We're not married." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Not married? What did that have to do with anything? We had been together for 2 years, talked about moving in together, even discussed future plans. And now, suddenly, I wasn't entitled to know what was going on in his life. I realized then that this wasn't the first time. The secrecy, the changes in behavior, the way he distanced himself from me emotionally, it all made sense. He'd been cheating for months, and I had been too blind, too trusting to see it. But what really broke me was the gaslighting. After I confronted him, he started twisting everything, making me question my own reality. He'd say things like, "You're overreacting. It was just a friend from work." Or, "You're making things up in your head." He was so convincing that for a while, I actually doubted myself. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But then came the ultimate betrayal. A mutual friend of ours, someone I'd known for years, reached out to me one day. She didn't want to get involved, but said she felt like I deserved to know the truth. Apparently, everyone in his circle knew about the other woman. They'd seen them together at events, dinners, even out of town for a weekend work trip. I was the only one who didn't know. That's when it hit me. He wasn't just cheating. He was living a double life, keeping me around while parading this other woman in front of people who knew us. The humiliation was overwhelming. How many times had I defended him when friends hinted that something seemed off? How many lies had I believed because I trusted him? It was like being stabbed in the back by someone you thought would always protect you. When I confronted him with the evidence, he didn't deny it. He just shrugged and said, "I didn't think it was a big deal. We weren't that serious anyway." That was the final straw. I packed my things and left that night, blocking his number and cutting ties with anyone who had known and kept it from me. The pain was unbearable for months. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, replaying every conversation, every moment where I should have seen the signs. I felt like a fool for not noticing sooner. But in the end, I learned one of the hardest lessons of my life. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. People don't change overnight without a reason. And if they start hiding things, whether it's their phone, their whereabouts, or their emotions, it's usually because they've got something to hide. Now, whenever I hear a phone buzzing in someone else's hand, or see someone get defensive over a simple question, I can't help but wonder what's going on beneath the surface. It's not that I don't trust people anymore, but I've learned to listen to my gut. If I had done that sooner, maybe I could have saved myself a lot of heartbreak. The thing is, you never think it'll happen to you. You hear about other people's stories, and you think, "I'd know if my partner was cheating." But when you're in it, it's easy to make excuses, to believe the lies, because the truth is too painful to confront. But if someone makes you feel like you're crazy for asking questions, like you're overreacting for wanting honesty, that's when you need to pay attention. Trust is earned, but it's also fragile. And once it's broken, it's hard to put the pieces back together. This happened a few years ago, but the memory of it still sends a shiver down my spine. It's not something I talk about often, mostly because I don't like to think about how close I came to not being here today. It was late spring and a few friends and I had decided to rent a cabin by a lake for a long weekend getaway. It was one of those places you see in movies, secluded in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The lake was beautiful, crystal clear water, the kind that made you want to jump right in. The cabin itself was rustic, a little run down, but it had everything we needed: a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a deck that overlooked the water. We thought it was perfect. There were 5 of us in total. Me, my best friend Luke, his girlfriend Sarah, and another couple, Tim and Emily. We'd all been friends since college, and we were excited for a weekend of grilling, swimming, and just getting away from the chaos of our lives. Everything was going great the first night. We had a bonfire, drank a little too much, and stayed up late telling ghost stories like we were kids again. The second day was more of the same. We spent most of it lounging by the lake, taking turns on the small rowboat the cabin's owners had left for us. As the sun started to set, we decided to take the boat out one last time. It was still warm, and the water was calm, so we figured it would be a nice way to end the day. We all piled into the boat, which was a bit of a tight squeeze with 5 people, but we didn't think much of it. Luke took the oars, and we paddled out to the middle of the lake, laughing and joking around like we always did. It was peaceful, too peaceful really. I remember thinking how still everything was, the only sound being the quiet splash of the oars cutting through the water. After a while, we decided to just drift and enjoy the silence. The sun was nearly down, casting this beautiful orange-pink glow across the water. It was one of those moments where everything feels perfect, you know? Like nothing could possibly go wrong. Then, out of nowhere, the boat jerked. It wasn't a big movement, but enough to make everyone sit up and look around. We all thought Luke had shifted his weight or something, but he swore he hadn't moved. We laughed it off, thinking maybe we'd hit a submerged log or something. Luke started to row us back toward the cabin, but a few minutes later, it happened again. This time, it was stronger, like something had bumped the bottom of the boat. I could see the look on everyone's faces shift from amusement to confusion. Emily even made a joke about the lake monster coming to get us, but her voice sounded nervous. We all tried to laugh, but it felt forced. Something wasn't right. Luke picked up the pace, trying to row us back faster. But then it happened again. This time, the boat tipped so hard that water sloshed over the side. We all screamed and grabbed onto the edges, trying to keep our balance. It felt like something big was under the boat. Something alive. "Did you hit something?" Tim asked, his voice tight with fear. "I didn't hit anything." Luke snapped, his eyes wide. "I don't know what the hell that was." At this point, panic started to set in. The lake was deep, and if we tipped over, we'd have a hard time swimming back to shore. Luke kept rowing, but he was clearly rattled. Sarah was gripping the sides of the boat, so hard her knuckles were white, and I could hear Emily whispering something to herself. Maybe a prayer, I don't know. And then it happened again. But this time, whatever it was didn't just bump the boat. It hit it hard. The entire boat lurched to the side, and before any of us could react, we were in the water. I remember the shock of the cold hitting me first like a punch to the chest. For a few seconds, everything was chaos. Splashing, screaming, the sound of water filling my ears. I struggled to surface, my clothes heavy and pulling me down. When I finally broke through, I gasped for air, looking around frantically for the others. Luke was closest to me, coughing and sputtering as he tried to keep his head above water. Tim and Emily were further away, clinging to each other, and Sarah. Sarah was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Sarah?" Luke yelled, his voice panicked. I turned in every direction, searching for any sign of her. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It felt like an eternity, but finally I saw her about 10 feet away, thrashing in the water, something pulling her under. I swear to God, there was something pulling her. Without thinking, I swam toward her as fast as I could. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there, but I had to try. When I reached her, I grabbed her arm and tried to pull her up, but it was like she was stuck, like something had a hold of her legs. She was screaming, her eyes wide with terror, and I'll never forget that look on her face. She was so scared, and I was so helpless. I kicked and pulled with everything I had, but it felt like we were fighting against something massive, something that didn't want to let her go. I don't know how long we struggled, but eventually, she broke free. I don't know if I freed her or if whatever had her just let go, but suddenly, she was floating, gasping for air. We swam back to the others as fast as we could. By some miracle, the boat had flipped upright, and we managed to climb back in, soaked and terrified. No one said anything for a long time. We just sat there, shivering, staring at the water, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, Luke started rowing us back to the cabin. We didn't talk the whole way, too scared to even make a sound. When we finally made it back to shore, we ran inside the cabin, locked the doors, and sat there in silence. I don't think anyone slept that night. We never figured out what happened. The next morning, we packed up and left, cutting the trip short. None of us ever wanted to go back, and we don't talk about it anymore. Sometimes, I'll bring it up as a joke, but there's always this uncomfortable silence that follows. We all know it wasn't just our imagination. Whatever was in that lake, it wasn't friendly, and I'm never going back. Alright, so this happened my sophomore year, and honestly, I still can't believe we didn't end up on the local news for it. It's one of those things where you look back and just shake your head like, how the hell did we pull that off? Anyway, the story revolves around this one substitute teacher we had. Let's call him Mr. Thompson. Now, Mr. Thompson was notorious at our school. He was one of those subs who'd show up maybe once or twice a month, always wearing the same crusty brown cardigan that looked like it was from the 1970s. The guy had this weird habit of humming classical music under his breath the entire time he taught. And when I say taught, I mean he barely did anything. He'd just sit at his desk, give us some random worksheet, and then pull out his newspaper. Classic sub move. The thing about Mr. Thompson was that nobody really took him seriously. He was this old, frail guy with a permanent scowl, but he never really yelled or did much to control the class. So naturally, we'd mess with him. Every time he showed up, someone would pull a prank. You know, harmless stuff, hiding the whiteboard markers, switching his newspaper for a copy of 17, or sneaking out of class one by one until half the room was empty. But then came the prank, the one that went way too far. It was the last week of school before spring break, and everyone was already in vacation mode. We were all just waiting to get out. So when Mr. Thompson showed up to sub for our history teacher, we knew it was going to be a free-for-all. Except this time, someone had a different idea. I'm talking about my friend Jason, who always had a bit of a twisted sense of humor. Jason had been plotting this prank for weeks, and it was ambitious to say the least. So, The plan was simple: fake a school lockdown. Yeah, I know. It sounds insane, and trust me, it was. Jason had somehow managed to get his hands on one of those police scanners. Don't ask me how, probably something sketchy online, and he figured out how to mimic the school's intercom system. It wasn't perfect, but it sounded close enough. So we're sitting in history class, pretending to work on some worksheet that nobody cared about, while Mr. Thompson sat at his desk, humming away and reading his paper. Jason, who sat in the back of the room, discreetly pulled out his little police scanner device and waited for the right moment. He looked at me and gave me a nod like, "Here we go." Suddenly, over the intercom, we hear this robotic-sounding voice say, "Attention, staff and students. The school is now under lockdown. This is not a drill. Please remain in your classrooms and follow lockdown procedures immediately." The second those words came over the speaker, the whole room went dead silent. We all exchanged glances, trying to figure out if this was real or not, but it sounded official. Even Mr. Thompson looked up from his paper, his face all confused and pale. I remember the exact moment he realized what was happening. He stood up so fast his chair fell over, and he started shouting, "Get down! Get down!" We were all trying not to laugh as we got down on the floor like we were supposed to during a real lockdown. Some kids crawled under their desks, while others just laid flat on the ground. Meanwhile, Jason was in the back, barely able to contain himself. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, was in full panic mode. He rushed to the door, slammed it shut, and turned off the lights like we were under siege or something. He kept muttering to himself, "This isn't good, this isn't good," pacing back and forth in front of the door. It was kind of wild watching him go from totally checked out to freaking out in a matter of seconds. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed the classroom phone and dialed the office. That's when things got really interesting. We could hear his conversation on the phone, and it became pretty clear the office had no idea what he was talking about. He kept saying, "We're in lockdown, what's going on?" And we could hear the receptionist on the other end, all confused, saying, "There's no lockdown, Mr. Thompson." You'd think that would have clued him in, right? No. Instead, Mr. Thompson went full survival mode. He slammed the phone down, ran back to the windows, and started pulling the blinds down like we were about to be raided. A couple of the kids in class couldn't hold it in anymore and started laughing, which just made him more paranoid. He snapped at us, "This is serious. Do you want to get us all killed?" At this point, Jason was trying to keep his cool, but he was grinning like a madman. I was honestly worried the dude was going to burst out laughing and blow the whole thing, but somehow he kept it together. The rest of us were dying inside, trying to act like we were scared while also trying not to look at each other, because if we did, we'd lose it. Then came the moment none of us expected. The door to the classroom burst open, and 2 security guards came charging in, yelling for everyone to get on the ground. Turns out, Mr. Thompson had called the wrong number when he called the office. He had somehow dialed the direct line to the security team. They thought there was an actual emergency happening in our classroom. The look on Jason's face was priceless. He went from smug to "oh shit" in about half a second. One of the guards grabbed Mr. Thompson and started asking him what was going on, and Mr. Thompson, completely frazzled, was trying to explain the lockdown. The intercom said we were in lockdown. I heard it. But then the guards checked the intercom system, and of course there was no lockdown message. That's when they started putting 2 and 2 together. They weren't stupid. They immediately turned to the class and asked who was behind it. Jason tried to stay quiet, but one of the kids sitting near him ratted him out in like 2 seconds. It was Jason. He has a thing that makes announcements. Thanks, Steve. The security guards dragged Jason out of the room. And as he was leaving, he looked back at us with this huge grin on his face like he'd just pulled off the greatest prank in the history of pranks. And honestly, in a way, he kind of did. Jason ended up getting suspended for 2 weeks, and the school went into full freak-out mode about security. We had assemblies about how serious it was to mess with lockdown procedures, and they even put in new protocols to prevent anything like that from happening again. It was a whole thing. But here's the kicker. Mr. Thompson never came back after that day. I don't know if he quit, retired, or just couldn't handle the stress anymore, but we never saw him again. Some people said he had a nervous breakdown, while others claimed he transferred to another district. Either way, we never got the chance to apologize, or maybe thank him for giving us one of the wildest days in high school history. So yeah, That's the story of how Jason faked a lockdown and almost gave our substitute teacher a heart attack. Definitely not something I'll ever forget. About 5 years ago, I started a fake online persona. At first, it was just a joke, something to pass the time when I was bored. I made this Instagram account where I posted random lifestyle photos, pictures of fancy coffee, cityscapes, sunsets, you know the drill. I didn't even show my face at first. But then things got out of hand. I got attention. People started following me like a lot of people, and that's where everything started to spiral. It wasn't me on that account. Not really. I mean, sure, I took the photos, but I wasn't living the life I was showing. The captions were total bullshit. Another day, another opportunity to seize, or feeling grateful for all the love today. Stuff like that. Truth is, I was sitting in my pajamas in a tiny apartment, working a dead-end job I hated. But I kept posting, and somehow people bought into it. The followers grew, and suddenly I had this fake version of myself, this better version, that people adored. So, I leaned into it. Hard. I started curating my posts, carefully choosing where to take photos, what to wear, even what kind of food to eat just to keep up appearances. I'd spend an hour setting up the perfect breakfast shot, even though I wasn't even hungry. Sometimes I'd walk around the city for hours just trying to find the right lighting to snap a picture of my coffee cup next to a random succulent plant. It was exhausting, but every time I got a new comment or a message from someone saying they loved my feed, it felt like a hit of dopamine. I couldn't stop. Then the weird part happened. People started to recognize me. In real life, I'd be out at a cafe or walking down the street, and someone would come up to me like, "Hey, I follow you on Instagram." At first, it freaked me out. I wasn't used to being recognized like that, but part of me liked it. It was like I was living two lives. In real life, I was a struggling 28-year-old just trying to pay rent. But online, I was this chic, polished, carefree woman who lived for the little things. The lines between the two versions of me started to blur. Then came the worst part. I started getting invitations. Brands wanted to send me stuff. People wanted to collaborate, and I didn't know what to do. I was too deep in this lie. There was no way I could show up to events or meetups without people realizing I wasn't this glamorous person I pretended to be. I mean, I couldn't even afford half the clothes I posted in my feed. They were either borrowed from friends or picked up at thrift stores just for the photo and returned the next day. I got scared. I stopped going out as much because I didn't want to bump into anyone who followed me. I ignored messages from brands, even though the idea of getting free stuff was tempting. I felt trapped. I had built this persona, and now I had no idea how to live up to it in real life. The turning point came when one of my old high school friends followed me on Instagram. She messaged me, all excited, saying how great I looked and how she couldn't believe how successful I'd become. I remember staring at my phone, feeling this intense wave of shame wash over me. I had no idea what to say. Should I tell her the truth? Should I keep up the act? In the end, I just responded with a vague thanks. Life's been crazy, and hoped she wouldn't dig too deep. But that moment haunted me for days. It was like the first crack in my carefully crafted facade. Eventually, the anxiety got too much. I'd spend hours lying awake at night, thinking about how my entire online presence was a lie. I'd panic every time someone tagged me in a post, worried that it would reveal the truth about my actual, very unglamorous life. It felt like a ticking time bomb. So, one day, I just deleted everything. No warning, no goodbye post. I hit deactivate and watched as my perfectly curated, fake life vanished in an instant. I thought I'd feel relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but honestly, it was mostly just fear. Fear that people would notice, fear that someone would ask why I disappeared. At first, a few people did reach out. I got some messages from followers wondering if everything was okay, but I ignored them. I ghosted everyone. Even my real-life friends were confused, but I made up excuses. Oh, I just got tired of social media, I'd say. Needed a break. The hardest part? My family has no idea this even happened. They never followed me online, never saw the double life I was leading. To them, I'm still just me, the quiet, hardworking daughter who visits on weekends. I sometimes wonder what they'd think if they knew about my secret Instagram life. Would they be proud? Embarrassed? I don't know. It's been a year since I deleted the account, and I still feel weird about it. Part of me misses the validation, the likes, the comments, but mostly I'm just ashamed. I spent so much time and energy trying to convince the world I was someone I wasn't. And for what? A few free coffees? Some compliments from strangers? I think about that sometimes. How easy it is to get sucked into creating this perfect, fake version of yourself online. How quickly it can spiral out of control. I'm still figuring out who I am without all of that, without the filter and the captions and the fake lifestyle. It's not easy, but I'm trying. So yeah, that's my secret. I spent years pretending to be someone I wasn't online, and now I'm just trying to figure out who I actually am in real life. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this, but I guess life doesn't always go the way you plan. It was one of those things that started innocently enough, but spiraled out of control before I even knew what was happening. So, I was 21, still living with my parents, working part-time while taking night classes at the local community college. My best friend, Ryan, had been my ride or die since high school. We grew up on the same street, played on the same basketball team, and basically did everything together. We were like brothers. His mom, Lisa, was like a second mom to me growing up, but after I turned 18, I started seeing her a little differently. Now I know how that sounds, but hear me out. Lisa wasn't just a typical suburban mom. She was in her early 40s, but looked like she was in her early 30s. She had this kind of effortless beauty, you know? Always in shape, always dressed like she was ready for brunch at some fancy place, but still down to earth. She was one of those moms that all the guys in high school joked about. You know the type. Hot, friendly, and always around just enough to make things awkward. Anyway, fast forward to last summer. Ryan got accepted into a grad program out of state, so he moved across the country. That left Lisa and her husband, Mark, empty nesters. Mark traveled a lot for work. He was a regional manager for some company and was gone like half the month. Lisa, on the other hand, was around a lot more, and we started bumping into each other a lot after Ryan left. At first, it was no big deal. She'd invite me over for dinner, and we'd talk about how Ryan was doing, swap funny stories, and catch up. It felt kind of natural, like I'd always been a part of their family, so it didn't feel weird spending time with her. Plus, I'd known her since I was a kid. I trusted her. But then one night, things shifted. It was a Friday evening, and I was supposed to meet up with some friends for drinks, but plans fell through last minute. Lisa texted me, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. She said Mark was out of town for the weekend, and she had a bottle of wine that was too good to drink alone. I figured why not? It was better than sitting at home, doing nothing. When I got there, she was already a couple glasses in, and the vibe was different. It wasn't like the usual dinners we had before. She was wearing this fitted dress, something that was definitely more date night than family dinner, if you know what I mean. But I didn't think too much of it. I figured she just wanted to dress up since she was home alone. We ate, we drank, and we talked. She kept pouring me more wine, and soon enough, I was feeling buzzed. Then after dinner, things got weird. We were sitting on the couch just talking about random stuff when she started asking me about my dating life. I gave her the usual, yeah, I'm seeing some people, but nothing serious answer, but she kept pushing. She wanted details. At first, I thought she was just being nosy, like the way moms can be sometimes. But then she started making comments about how she hadn't been on a date in years and how men her age just don't appreciate her. I didn't know how to respond. I just laughed it off, trying to keep things light. But then she looked at me, really looked at me, and said, I bet you'd appreciate a woman like me. I froze. My heart started racing, and my brain was screaming at me to leave, but my body wasn't moving. I didn't know what to say. It was like one of those moments where everything slows down, and you realize you're standing at the edge of a cliff, but you're not sure if you're going to jump or turn around. Before I could process what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. I was shocked at first. I mean, this was Lisa, Ryan's mom. But then something clicked. I kissed her back. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was years of teenage hormones and curiosity finally bubbling over. But whatever it was, I didn't stop. We made out for what felt like forever, and then things escalated. She pulled me into her bedroom, and everything just blurred from there. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like all the boundaries I thought existed between us just disappeared. In that moment, she wasn't Ryan's mom anymore. She was just Lisa, and I wanted her. The next morning was brutal. I woke up next to her and instantly felt this wave of guilt. It hit me all at once. What I'd done, who I'd done it with. I barely managed to mumble some excuse about needing to go home before I bolted out of there. As soon as I got in my car, I felt like I was going to puke. I knew I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I spent the rest of the weekend trying to forget it. I kept telling myself it was a one-time thing, that it wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Sure enough, a few days later, Lisa texted me, asking if I wanted to come over to talk. I knew what that meant, but I went anyway. We didn't just talk. It happened again and again. It became this thing. Whenever Mark was out of town, Lisa would text me, and I'd come over. We'd hang out, have dinner, drink wine, and then end up in her bed. It was this weird, messed up routine that I couldn't stop myself from falling into. Part of me felt disgusted with myself, but another part of me was addicted to the thrill of it. We kept it going for months. All the while, I'd still talk to Ryan like nothing had changed. He'd call me from across the country, telling me about his classes, his new friends, and how much he missed home. And the whole time, I'd be sitting there with this gnawing guilt in my gut, knowing what I was doing behind his back. I thought I could keep it going forever, that maybe we'd never get caught. But then, everything blew up. One night, I was over at Lisa's house, and we were in the middle of, all of a sudden, we heard the front door open. I froze. My heart stopped. It was Mark. He was supposed to be out of town for work, but apparently his trip got cut short. I barely had time to grab my clothes before he walked into the bedroom. The look on his face when he saw me there, I'll never forget it. It was this mix of shock, rage, and disbelief. He didn't say a word. He just turned around and walked out of the house. Lisa was in full panic mode, trying to figure out what to do. I was too freaked out to even think straight, so I just left. I haven't spoken to her since. Mark filed for divorce a few weeks later, and Ryan still doesn't know. I couldn't bring myself to tell him. We're still friends, but there's this constant weight hanging over me, this secret I'm keeping from him. Every time we talk, I wonder if he'll ever find out. And if he does, I'm pretty sure that'll be the end of our friendship. So yeah, that's my story. It's messy, it's complicated, and I'm not proud of it. But it happened, and now I have to live with it. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how tempting they are. Because once you do, there's no going back. And trust me, it's not worth the fallout. This one's a little embarrassing, but I figure if my stupidity can save someone else's life, it's worth sharing. Let me tell you about the time I almost died because of a space heater. Yup, those tiny little portable heaters that you put in your room to make it all warm and cozy. Nearly killed me. It was winter, and I just moved into this old, drafty apartment. The place had terrible insulation, and no matter how much I cranked the heat, it felt like Antarctica inside. So, like any sensible adult, I bought myself a little space heater to keep next to my bed at night. Seemed like a brilliant solution. Nice and toasty without having to heat the whole apartment. I'd been using the heater for about a week, and everything was fine. I'd leave it on all night, wake up nice and warm, no issues. Well, one night, I guess I must have kicked the blanket off the bed in my sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling a bit off. Groggy, headache, weirdly nauseous like I'd had one too many drinks the night before. But I hadn't even touched a drop. I remember rolling over in bed, squinting at the sunlight coming through the window, trying to shake off that weird feeling. That's when I noticed the space heater still running next to my bed. The room was so hot, it felt like a sauna, but I was too out of it to really process what was going on. I figured I just needed some fresh air, so I stumbled out of bed, cracked a window, and sat back down, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Except it didn't. I started to feel worse. My heart was racing, and every breath felt like I was sucking in warm, stale air. I thought maybe I was coming down with the flu or something. But then I stood up to get some water, and boom, the room spun, and I nearly passed out. That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. My first thought was that I needed to get out of the apartment, but I couldn't figure out why. At this point, I was seriously struggling to think straight. It felt like my brain was stuck in a fog. I grabbed my phone and Googled my symptoms: headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, and suddenly everything clicked: carbon monoxide poisoning. And the worst part? That stupid little space heater was the culprit. Now, let me give you some context. I had no idea that space heaters could even produce carbon monoxide. I thought that was just a risk with gas heaters, not the little electric ones. Turns out I was dead wrong, literally. Some space heaters, especially the older ones or those with certain malfunctions, can produce enough carbon monoxide to fill a room. And if you're not careful, you might not even know it's happening until it's too late. I don't know how, but in my dazed state, I managed to throw on a jacket and stagger out of my apartment. The second I stepped outside into the cold air, it felt like I could breathe again. I sat on the stoop, gulping in fresh air, and slowly, the fog in my head started to clear. After about 10 minutes, the headache started to fade, and I realized just how close I'd come to not waking up at all that morning. Here's the kicker. I didn't even have a carbon monoxide detector in my apartment. If I hadn't felt weird and gotten up when I did, I might have just slept through the whole thing. And I wouldn't be here telling you this story. I'd be another tragic statistic. Some dumbass who died because he didn't know his space heater could turn into a silent killer. After I finally felt stable enough to stand, I went back inside, turned off the heater, opened all the windows, and called the landlord to give him a piece of my mind. Then I went straight to the store and bought a carbon monoxide detector. If you don't have one of those things, get one. Seriously, it's cheap and it could save your life. I had no idea how dangerous that little heater could be. I always thought carbon monoxide poisoning was something that happened with big, faulty furnaces or car exhausts in closed garages, but no. Turns out, even a small, malfunctioning appliance can leak enough to kill you in your sleep. And the scariest part? You won't even know it's happening. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you just start feeling sleepy, and the next thing you know, lights out. Forever. A couple of days after my close call, I did some more research and found out that thousands of people get hospitalized or die every year from carbon monoxide poisoning, and a lot of them didn't even realize their space heaters were to blame. The heaters overheat, malfunction, or have improper ventilation, and before you know it, you've got a room full of toxic gas. I'm lucky I woke up when I did. Looking back, I should have known better. I should have had a detector, should have read the instructions on the heater more carefully, should have aired out the room. But we always think, it'll never happen to me, right? Until it does. Now, I'm that annoying guy who tells everyone I know to check their space heaters and always have a carbon monoxide detector in the house. I've even given them as gifts to people. Yeah, I've become that guy. Because I came this close to being one of those people who dies from something so stupid and preventable. So, here's my PSA. If you're using a space heater or any kind of heating appliance, make sure you've got a carbon monoxide detector in the room. Don't leave the heater on while you sleep, and for the love of all things good, check the damn thing before you plug it in. Trust me, you do not want to wake up feeling like your brain's being cooked, wondering if this is how it ends. It's crazy how something as small as a little heater can turn into a death trap in a matter of hours. I'm just glad I got out when I did. But there's a lot of people who don't. So yeah, if you're reading this, do yourself a favor. Be smarter than I was. Don't let a cheap, cozy heater take you out in your sleep. Stay warm, but stay alive. That's all I'm saying. I never really believed in conspiracy theories. I was the type of person who would roll their eyes whenever someone started talking about secret government projects or hidden agendas. I used to think, how could something so big be kept secret for so long? But then something happened to me that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It all started when I went on a hiking trip with a few friends. We were trekking through a remote part of a national forest. No cell service, no people, just us and miles of wilderness. It was supposed to be a 3-day trip, a way to disconnect from the chaos of city life and get back to nature. Everything was going great for the first 2 days. The weather was perfect, the trails were clear, and the nights were calm. Until the second night, when we heard the noises. It was around midnight, and we were all sitting around the campfire, just talking and laughing, when we heard something strange in the distance. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I'd ever heard before. It was this low, mechanical hum, almost like a drone, but deeper. At first, we thought maybe it was some kind of distant machinery or a plane flying overhead, but the sound didn't fade away. It kept getting louder, and then it stopped. Completely. Like someone had turned off a switch. We all kind of looked at each other, unsure of what to think. One of my friends joked about aliens, but we all laughed it off and went back to our conversation. The next morning, we packed up and continued our hike. That's when things started to get weird. The first strange thing we noticed was that the trail markers were gone. These were marked trails, well-maintained, with signs and markers every few miles. But now, they were gone. It was like someone had come through and removed every sign, every marker. We were miles from anywhere, with no cell service and no way to figure out where we were. But that wasn't even the worst part. As we kept walking, we started to notice something off about the trees. At first, it was subtle. The bark on some of the trees looked different, like it had been burned or scraped. But then we realized that every tree around us had the same pattern of damage, like something had clawed through them all. It was strange, but we still didn't think too much of it. Maybe it was some kind of pest or disease affecting the trees. But then we found the first symbol. Carved into one of the trees was a strange symbol, nothing any of us had ever seen before. It looked almost like an eye, with jagged lines radiating from the center. My friend, the one who had joked about aliens the night before, stopped laughing. He said it reminded him of something he had seen online in one of those conspiracy theory forums. Something about secret government programs or cults. We all brushed it off at the time, but the unease in the group was palpable. We kept walking, hoping to find our way back to the main trail. But the deeper we went into the forest, the more symbols we found. Carved into trees, etched into rocks, even scratched into the dirt along the path. Each one was slightly different, but they all had that same eerie, I-like shape. By this point, we were getting worried. No one wanted to admit it, but we were lost. And whatever was out there, leaving these symbols, was watching us. That night, we set up camp again, even though none of us felt safe. The forest felt different now, quieter, heavier. The air was thick with tension, and none of us could sleep. Around midnight, we heard the humming again. But this time it was closer, much closer. It wasn't coming from the sky, though. It was coming from the trees, from the ground beneath us. It was like the entire forest was vibrating with this low, mechanical hum. We grabbed our flashlights and started scanning the area, but we couldn't see anything. Just trees and darkness. Then we saw the light. A faint, bluish glow in the distance, like something out of a sci-fi movie. It hovered just beyond the tree line, flickering like it was alive. We debated whether to go toward it or stay put, but before we could decide, it disappeared. Just blinked out of existence like it was never there. We didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, we packed up and decided to head back the way we came. Forget the rest of the trip, we just wanted to get out of there. But no matter how far we walked, the trail didn't look familiar. It was like we were walking in circles, even though we hadn't strayed from the path. We were all starting to panic, and that's when we found the cabin. It was an old, decrepit thing, half hidden by overgrown trees and brush. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years, maybe even decades. But the door was slightly open, and inside, we could hear that same low humming. Against our better judgment, we decided to go inside. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It was damp and musty, like the place had been abandoned for years. But then we saw the walls. They were covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen in the forest, carved into the wood, painted in some kind of dark, oily substance. And in the center of the room, there was a single chair with wires and cables hanging from the ceiling, all connected to a large metallic box in the corner. None of us wanted to get any closer, but my friend, the one who had joked about aliens, walked up to the box. He touched one of the cables, and as soon as he did, the humming stopped. Completely. And then, we heard a voice. It wasn't coming from any of us. It was coming from the box, or maybe from the air around us. It was hard to tell, but it was clear, and it said just one thing: leave. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted out of there, not stopping until we were miles away from the cabin. Somehow, by sheer luck or instinct, we found our way back to the main trail. None of us spoke the entire hike back to the car. We never reported what we found. Who will believe us? But since that trip, I've done some research, and I've found other stories, people who've experienced similar things in remote areas. Symbols humming, strange lights. Some of them claim it's part of a government experiment. Others say it's something extraterrestrial. I don't know what I believe anymore, but I do know this. There's something out there, something we're not supposed to see. And whatever it is, it's watching us. All right, buckle up. My first day in the industry was a total mess, and I still can't believe I didn't walk out right then and there. I guess I was just stubborn, or maybe desperate. Anyway, here's how it went down. I was 19, living in a tiny apartment with 2 roommates who were constantly late on rent, leaving me to cover their part. It was getting out of hand. I had 2 part-time jobs at the time, one at a fast food place and another doing night shifts at a grocery store, and I still wasn't making ends meet. One night, I was browsing Craigslist, classic, right? For anything, literally anything, that would pay better. That's when I saw an ad for a gentleman's club hiring dancers. No experience necessary. I don't know what came over me, but I figured, why not? It couldn't be worse than flipping burgers, and I'd heard stories about girls making bank doing it. So I emailed them. Got a response the next day. The manager asked if I could come in for an audition that same night. I barely had time to think it over, but at that point, I was too curious to back out. When I showed up, the place wasn't at all what I imagined. The front was super low-key, almost sketchy. I half expected to see some seedy movie characters lurking around. But when I walked in, the inside was surprisingly clean and well-lit, like they were trying really hard to look upscale. The manager, this guy in his 40s who had slicked back hair and a too-tight suit, greeted me at the door. "You're here to audition?" he asked, like he didn't already know. I nodded, trying to keep my nerves in check. He led me to the back, where a few other girls were getting ready. They looked at me, not exactly unfriendly, but definitely sizing me up. I suddenly felt like I was back in high school, trying to figure out where I fit in. One of the girls, a tall, confident brunette with glitter all over her chest, looked me up and down and said, "First time?" I nodded again, trying not to seem as terrified as I felt. "You'll be fine," she said, smirking. "Just don't trip in your heels." I didn't have heels. I had cheap platform sandals I bought at a thrift store earlier that day, thinking they'd be good enough. Spoiler alert, they weren't. The manager came back in and told me to get on stage for a quick tryout. That's when the panic really hit. I mean, I'd danced before, in my room, at parties, but never in front of a bunch of strangers who were literally there to judge me. I wanted to bolt, but my feet carried me onto the stage before my brain had a chance to intervene. The music started, something slow and sultry, and I froze. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out into the dimly lit room, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. The manager was sitting in one of the chairs, arms crossed, waiting for me to, actually move. So, I grabbed the pole. I'd seen enough movies to know that's what you're supposed to do, right? Wrong. I grabbed it awkwardly, tried to swing around like I'd seen other girls do, and promptly lost my grip. My foot slipped off the platform, and I damn near fell on my face. The manager let out this sigh, like he was already over it, and I wanted to disappear. But I didn't. Somehow, I managed to keep going. I swayed a bit, touched my hair, tried to look sexy, but I'm sure I just looked like a deer in headlights. I think I only lasted 2 minutes before the music ended and the manager stood up. He looked at me, expression unreadable, and said, "You're hired. Start tomorrow night." I was floored. I had been terrible. I knew it, he knew it, but apparently they needed bodies on stage more than they cared about talent. I left that night feeling a weird mix of relief and dread. I mean, I had a job now, a job that might actually pay my bills, but I had no idea how I was going to pull it off without embarrassing myself further. Fast forward to the next night. I show up at the club in a cheap black dress I bought on sale. It wasn't even close to what the other girls were wearing, but I figured it was better than nothing. The brunette from the night before, her name was Lexi, was there again, getting ready in the dressing room. She gave me a look like she knew exactly what kind of disaster I was about to be. "Nervous?" she asked, even though she clearly knew the answer. I laughed awkwardly. "Yeah, a little." She shrugged and said, "Don't worry, most of the guys are too drunk to care what you do up there. Just smile and shake your ass. That's all they really want." Comforting, right? So, I went on stage. This time the club was full, like packed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might actually burst out of my chest. But I remember what Lexi said, just smile and shake your ass. So, that's what I did. The first couple of songs were rough. I was stiff, unsure of myself, barely moving in sync with the music. But then something clicked. Maybe it was the alcohol because, yes, I took a couple of shots beforehand, or maybe it was the adrenaline, but by the third song I started to relax. I let go of the pole and just danced, trying not to overthink it. Then, something unexpected happened. A guy sitting near the stage. He was wearing a baseball cap and looked like your average frat bro, tossed a $20 bill at my feet. Not a crumpled up dollar, not a 5, a 20. I couldn't believe it. I shot him a smile, and he winked at me, clearly enjoying the attention. More money started coming in after that. Singles mostly, but every little bit felt like a victory. By the end of the night, I had about $150 stuffed into my bra and garter, which was more than I made in a week at my other jobs. When my shift ended, I went back to the dressing room, exhausted but strangely proud of myself. Lexi was there, counting her money. She glanced at me and said, "Not bad for your first night." I smiled. "Thanks." She nodded. "You'll get the hang of it. Just don't let this place suck you in." I didn't really understand what she meant at the time, but it stuck with me. I kept coming back, night after night, getting better at the whole dancing thing. I learned how to work the room, how to talk to customers without feeling weird, and most importantly, how to separate myself from the job. It's easy to lose yourself in that world if you're not careful, and I saw a lot of girls do just that. After about a year, I saved up enough money to move out of that shitty apartment and quit my other jobs. The club wasn't glamorous, but it gave me something I didn't have before: freedom. Looking back, that first day was a total disaster, but it also marked the beginning of something I never thought I'd do. It wasn't easy, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerless. That's something I'll never forget. This happened about 15 years ago when I was in college. My friends and I had this yearly tradition of going on a road trip every summer before school started again. Just one last hurrah before we got back to the grind. This particular year, we decided to go camping at a state park up in northern Michigan. It was supposed to be this big weekend of bonfires, beer, and stupid stories. Just your typical college guy trip. But what ended up happening still gives me the creeps when I think about it. There were 4 of us, me, my buddy James, his cousin Brad, and this guy Tom, who was kind of a new addition to the group. He was dating one of our friends, and she asked if we could bring him along. No one really knew him that well, but he seemed cool enough, so we figured why not. The more the merrier, right? Anyway, we drove up to the park, set up camp, and spent the day hiking and goofing off like idiots. As night fell, we got a fire going and started drinking, telling ghost stories, and just being typical 20-something-year-old guys. It was one of those nights where everything seemed perfect. Stars were out, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were crickets and the occasional crackle of the fire. It felt like the exact kind of memory we'd look back on and laugh about. But around midnight, things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but that feeling when everything just suddenly gets too quiet? Like even the crickets stop chirping and you're left with this weird, heavy silence? That's what happened. We were all sitting around the fire, and it was like the entire forest had gone dead. I glanced at James, and I could tell he felt it too because he stopped mid-sentence and just kind of stared into the trees. "Y'all hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Brad replied, but I could see he was already looking around, getting uneasy. "Nothing. That's the problem," James said, lowering his voice. "It's too quiet." We all sat there for a moment, listening. The air felt thick, like the whole world was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe it was just the beer messing with me. But then Tom, who had been pretty quiet the whole trip, stood up. "We should head back to the tents," he said suddenly. "Dude, we're camping. This is what we're here for. To sit out, enjoy the fire." I started, but he cut me off. "No, I mean it. We should go back now," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just urgency, it was fear. Genuine fear. Now, at this point, the mood had shifted from fun to uncomfortable, and no one was really feeling the vibe anymore. So, against my better judgment, I decided maybe it was time to call it a night. We put out the fire and started making our way back to the tents, which were set up about 50 yards away, just on the edge of the tree line. As we got closer to the tents, that weird, quiet feeling followed us. It was like the night had swallowed all sound. Not even the wind was blowing, and every step we took seemed deafening in the silence. By the time we reached the tents, I was on edge, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds like I was expecting something to jump out at us. We crawled into our tents, and I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just nerves. But after about 10 minutes of lying there in the dark, I heard it. A faint rustling sound like something moving just outside our campsite. At first, I thought it was just one of the guys, maybe sneaking off to take a leak, but then I heard it again, this low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. My heart started racing, and I held my breath listening. The sound was getting closer, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever was out there didn't care if it was being heard. I wanted to call out to the guys, ask if anyone else was hearing this, but my throat felt like it was glued shut. Then all of a sudden, I heard Brad whisper from the other tent. "Do you guys hear that?" Relief flooded through me knowing I wasn't the only one hearing it. But that relief quickly turned to panic when James, who had been the calmest of all of us, whispered back, "Stay inside the tents. Don't move." Now, when James was scared, you knew something was wrong. I lay there, barely breathing, as the sound continued, circling around our campsite. It felt like it went on forever, this agonizingly slow, dragging noise. Every time it stopped, I thought maybe it was gone, but then it would start again, closer this time. At one point, I swear I heard it right outside my tent, like it was just inches away from the fabric. I shut my eyes, praying it would pass. But then there was this low, growling sound, a deep, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. I felt like my heart was about to pound out of my chest, and all I could do was lie there, frozen in fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the noise stopped. The growling faded, and everything went silent again. I didn't dare move. I didn't even want to unzip the tent to check if it was really gone. The next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight streaming through the tent. I must have passed out at some point, though I don't know how, considering the terror that gripped me the whole night. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked outside, half expecting to see some sign of whatever had been out there, but everything looked normal. Peaceful even. James, Brad, and Tom came out of their tents, and no one said anything at first. We just kind of stood there, like we were all trying to figure out if what happened last night was real or some kind of collective nightmare. It wasn't until we started packing up that we found something. About 10 feet from where our tents had been, the ground was disturbed, deep grooves, like something had been dragged across the dirt. And in the middle of those grooves was a single footprint. But it wasn't from a person. It was huge, bigger than any animal I've ever seen, and it had long, claw-like impressions at the toes. We didn't stick around to figure out what had left it. We packed up faster than I thought possible and got the hell out of there. None of us ever talked about that night again. Even Tom, who had been the first to sense something was wrong, never mentioned it. But I know we all remember. Every time I even think about going camping, that growl echoes in the back of my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there that night, it was watching us. So, this story happened during my senior year, and it's probably the craziest thing I've ever been part of. I don't know if you guys had a senior skip day at your school, but it was a big deal for us. Every year, the seniors would skip a day of school in the spring and go do something stupid, usually just hanging out at the beach or getting drunk in the woods. But my class, we decided to take it to a whole new level. It started with a guy in my grade named Kevin. Kevin was the kind of dude who was always pushing the envelope, always trying to outdo everyone else. He had this reputation for doing dumb but legendary stuff, like the time he climbed onto the roof of the school during homecoming and mooned the entire football team. So naturally, when senior skip day came around, Kevin had to make it bigger than just ditching class. He had plans. Now, I don't know where Kevin got the idea, but he convinced a bunch of us to break into the school at night and throw a party in the pool area. Yes, we had a pool at our high school. Fancy, I know. The plan was to sneak in, throw a massive pool party, drink, blast music, the whole deal, and then be out by morning. Genius, right? Looking back, it was so stupid. But at the time, it felt like the perfect plan. We were invincible. What could go wrong? So a group of about 20 of us decided we were in. We all met up at Kevin's house that night to prep. By prep, I mean we downed a few beers, because of course we did. At around midnight, we snuck out and headed to the school. Kevin had figured out that one of the side doors near the gym wasn't locked properly, so we all slipped inside. I remember my heart pounding, feeling like I was in some kind of high-stakes spy movie, even though in reality, we were just a bunch of dumb high schoolers sneaking into our own school. When we got to the pool area, Kevin pulled out the boom box. Yes, a boom box. This was before everyone just used their phones for music, and cranked up some classic rock. A couple of guys stripped down to their underwear and jumped into the pool. And just like that, the party was on. Someone had brought a bottle of vodka, which quickly got passed around, and within minutes, we were all hyped up, jumping into the pool, screaming and laughing. For a while, it was perfect. I mean, it felt like a scene out of a movie. The music blasting, everyone partying, the water splashing around, and the best part, nobody had caught us yet. It was like the ultimate high school rebellion. We even started chanting seniors like idiots. Then Kevin, because of course it was Kevin, decided to take things up a notch. He climbed up onto the lifeguard stand at the edge of the pool, shouting at the top of his lungs like he was some kind of king. "I'm gonna do it," he screamed, waving his arms around. We all turned to see what insane thing he had planned this time, but nothing could have prepared us for what happened next. Without warning, Kevin yanked down his swim trunks, stood stark naked at the top of the lifeguard stand, and screamed, "Cannonball," before launching himself into the pool. He hit the water with the biggest splash I'd ever seen, and for a second, everyone just stood there in shock. I mean, we'd seen Kevin do some wild stuff before, but this was next level. He popped back up from the water, completely naked, laughing like a maniac. And then, because of course it was perfect timing, the pool lights suddenly turned on. We all froze. No one had even thought about the fact that the pool had automatic timers set for the lights. In an instant, the whole area was lit up like a football stadium. And just as we were about to start panicking, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of keys jangling and footsteps echoing down the hallway. Security. We were screwed. Everyone started freaking out, grabbing their clothes, and scrambling to get out of the pool. People were slipping and sliding on the wet tile, and it was pure chaos. Kevin was still laughing, trying to pull his wet swim trunks back on, while the rest of us were running around like headless chickens. I don't know how, but we all managed to get out of the pool area and duck into the locker rooms just as the security guard came in. We could hear him walking around, probably confused as hell by the wet footprints and the random items of clothing left behind. For what felt like an eternity, we were crammed together in the locker room, holding our breath, trying not to laugh or scream or completely lose it. Finally, the footsteps faded away, and we thought we were in the clear. But Kevin, because Kevin is Kevin, decided that we couldn't just leave without one last hurrah. So, this idiot grabs a towel, ties it around his neck like a cape, and runs back out into the pool area shouting, "I'm the king of the world." That's when the second security guard showed up. Yeah, turns out there were 2 guards making rounds that night. We had no chance. Long story short, we all got busted. The guards rounded us up, dripping wet, still in our swimsuits, and sat us down in the principal's office until they could figure out what to do with us. Some of the guys tried to come up with excuses, but there was no getting out of it. We were caught red-handed. The next day, we all had to explain ourselves to the principal, who looked like he was trying hard not to laugh the entire time. In the end, we didn't get expelled, but we were all banned from senior skip day, which honestly didn't matter because we had already done the most epic skip day possible. We also had to pay for some damages to the pool area. Apparently, the vodka bottle someone dropped had cracked a tile. And Kevin? He got banned from prom. But here's the kicker. Kevin was totally fine with it. In fact, he told us later that getting banned from prom was worth it because, in his words, how many people can say they threw a naked cannonball in the school pool at midnight? So yeah, that's my wild high school story. Senior skip day? Nailed it. It was my first serious relationship, and looking back, I should have seen the cracks forming long before everything fell apart. We had been together for almost 3 years, and while we'd had our ups and downs, I really thought we were solid. The kind of couple that people described as meant for each other. But the signs were there. I just wasn't ready to face them. The first thing that shifted was her phone usage. We used to leave our phones lying around, share memes, laugh at random texts from friends. There was zero suspicion because there was no reason to be. But one day, she put a lock on her phone, out of the blue. No explanation, no reason, just this new barrier between us. I asked her about it, casually, and she brushed it off. I just want some privacy. You know how it is. Except I didn't know how it was. I mean, sure, everyone deserves privacy, but this was different. She wasn't just being private. She was being secretive. She'd start taking her phone with her everywhere, even to the bathroom, which she never used to do. The biggest flag, though? The phone was always face down. Always. It was subtle at first, but then I couldn't unsee it. We'd be watching TV, and there it was flipped over, like it held the world's deepest secret. And maybe in a way it did. Then came the girls' nights out. I have absolutely no issue with anyone wanting time away from their partner. Hell, I encouraged it. I'd say things like, "Go have fun, you deserve it." And at first it was great. She'd come home a little tipsy, tell me funny stories about what happened with her friends, and we'd laugh about it together. But after a while, those nights became more frequent. They also started ending later. She'd stumble in at 2 a.m., sometimes 3 a.m., with barely any explanation. If I asked where she'd been, she'd get defensive, saying things like, "Why do you care? I'm just with my friends." I try to brush it off. I didn't want to be the overbearing boyfriend, the kind who tracks every move and questions everything. But something felt off. The stories she used to tell me after her nights out were becoming vague, almost rehearsed. I'd ask her who she went out with, and she'd say, "Just the girls, you don't know them," even though I knew most of her friends. When I pressed further, she'd roll her eyes and say I was being paranoid. It was like every time I asked a question, I was the bad guy. Around this time, she also started caring a lot more about her appearance. Now, she's always been someone who liked to look good, and I love that about her. But this was different. She started buying new clothes, stuff she didn't normally wear. She'd always been into comfortable, casual outfits, but suddenly she was rocking these tight dresses and heels, even on casual hangouts. It wasn't for me though. I noticed because when we went out together, she'd dress like she always had. But when she was heading out without me, that's when she'd really make an effort. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was impossible not to notice. Then came the sudden mood changes. One day, she was sweet, affectionate, the girl I fell in love with. The next, she was cold, distant, like I was a stranger she barely tolerated. And the worst part? She started picking fights over the smallest things. I'd ask her how her day was, and she'd snap. "Why do you always need to know what I'm doing?" It was exhausting, and I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells around her, not knowing what would set her off. The biggest red flag, though, was when she started accusing me of cheating. It was out of nowhere. I've never cheated in my life, not even thought about it. But she'd say things like, "You were checking out that girl, weren't you?" Or, "I know you've been talking to someone else." At first, I was confused. Then I realized it was projection. She was trying to flip the script, make me the guilty one, so she didn't have to face her own guilt. It was like she was creating these imaginary scenarios in her head where I was the bad guy, all to justify whatever she was doing behind my back. The moment everything came crashing down was a random Tuesday night. She'd been distant for days, and I couldn't take the silence anymore, so I asked her outright, "Are you seeing someone else?" She froze. I'll never forget the look on her face. It wasn't shock or anger. It was fear, like she knew she was caught. But instead of denying it, she just started crying. I didn't even have to say anything else. She admitted it. There was someone else. Someone she'd been seeing for months, while I'd been here, trying to figure out what was going wrong between us. Turns out it wasn't just some random guy. It was someone she worked with. They'd been spending more and more time together, grabbing drinks after work, texting late into the night, until one thing led to another. The worst part? She said it started because she felt like we'd lost our connection, like I hadn't been paying enough attention to her. Even though I felt like I'd been doing everything I could to make her happy. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. She kept talking, apologizing, saying she didn't mean for it to happen, that she still loved me, and that it was all a mistake. But I couldn't listen. All I could think about was the months of gaslighting, the lies, the manipulation. All the times I questioned myself, wondering if I was being crazy for thinking something was wrong, when all along I had been right. We broke up that night. There wasn't even a discussion. Once she admitted to cheating, there was nothing left to talk about. I packed my things and left. It took me a long time to get over it. The betrayal wasn't just about the cheating. It was about how she made me feel like I was the problem. She turned my insecurities against me, made me question my own reality, all while she was the one doing things behind my back. Looking back, all the signs were there. The phone secrecy, the nights out, the accusations, the sudden changes in behavior. I just didn't want to believe it. When you're in love with someone, you ignore the things that don't add up, because admitting the truth means accepting that the person you care about isn't who you thought they were. Now, whenever I see those little red flags in other people's relationships, I get that sinking feeling in my gut. I try not to assume the worst, but I also know how easy it is to overlook what's right in front of you when you don't want to face it. If someone starts accusing you of things you're not doing, if they suddenly become secretive or start acting out of character, trust your instincts. You don't want to be the last one to know. I was probably 22 when it happened, and I still get chills just thinking about it. I don't talk about it much anymore, partly because people never believe me, and partly because it still messes with my head. So, it was winter, and I was driving home from a weekend trip with some friends. It was late, maybe 11 p.m., and I was on this stretch of highway that cuts through the woods. It's one of those roads that feels like it goes on forever. No street lights, no gas stations, just miles of trees and the occasional deer darting across the road. I was alone in the car, half listening to some podcast, trying to stay awake. It had started snowing lightly at first, but it was picking up and the road was getting slick. I wasn't really worried, though. I'd driven in worse conditions before, and my car had all-wheel drive. Still, I slowed down a bit just to be safe. About 20 minutes into this snowy stretch, I noticed something odd, a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. Now, this was strange because I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. I thought it was just another traveler like me, so I didn't think much of it at first. But as the minutes passed, the headlights didn't get any closer. They just stayed at the same distance, maybe a quarter mile behind me, moving at the exact same speed as me. I remember glancing in the mirror again, wondering if maybe they were having car trouble or something. But no, they were just there, hanging back. It was weird, but I figured they'd pass me eventually, or I'd hit a town and lose them. No big deal, right? Except it kept going. 15, 20 minutes passed, and those headlights never got closer or farther away. Just this constant, eerie presence in my rearview mirror. I started getting this uneasy feeling in my gut, like something was wrong. It's hard to explain, but you know when you're being watched? That's what it felt like. I cranked up the heat in the car, but I could feel the cold sweat forming on my neck. By this point, the snow was coming down harder, and the road was completely covered. I had to slow down even more to keep control of the car, but the headlights didn't. They stayed perfectly paced with me, like they were mimicking my every move. I started to wonder if it was some kind of prank, like maybe it was my friends messing with me. But there's no way they could have known where I was. Plus, none of my friends drove a car like that. That's when things got really freaky. I went around this bend in the road, and for a split second, the headlights disappeared behind the curve. When I came out the other side, I expected to see them again in my mirror, but they were gone. I glanced back, expecting to see taillights disappearing into the night, or maybe the car pulling off the road. Nothing. Just darkness. I felt this weird mixture of relief and dread. It didn't make any sense. They couldn't have just vanished. I slowed down even more, squinting into the rearview mirror, trying to figure out where they'd gone. That's when I saw it. A shape. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snow or my tired eyes playing games, but no, there was definitely something there. In the mirror, just beyond the reach of my headlights, I could see a figure walking along the side of the road. It was tall, unnaturally tall, like maybe 7 or 8 feet, and it was moving in this strange, jerky way, like it was injured or didn't quite know how to walk. Its limbs were long and thin, almost spindly, and it wore something dark, maybe a coat or a cloak. I couldn't make out a face, and I didn't want to. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I don't know why, but I slammed on the gas. I don't think I even made the conscious decision to do it. My brain just went into full fight or flight mode, and flight won out. The tires spun for a second before gripping the snow, and my car lurched forward. I glanced back one last time and saw the thing stop. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching me as I sped away. I must have driven for another hour without seeing a single car or a sign of life. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so hard. Eventually, I hit a small town, the kind with one gas station and a diner that's closed by 9. I pulled into the gas station, parked under the fluorescent lights, and just sat there for a while trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that thing standing behind me, but nothing was there. After a few minutes, I got out, walked into the station, and grabbed a coffee. The guy behind the counter looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I I wasn't about to tell him what had just happened. I stayed in that gas station for almost an hour before I worked up the nerve to get back on the road. When I did, I drove straight to my apartment, parked the car, and went inside without looking back. I still don't know what I saw that night. I've told a few people about it, but most of them just laugh it off or tell me it was probably a trick of the light, or maybe I was just tired. But I know what I saw. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't human. And the weirdest part? A few weeks later, I was scrolling through some local news online, and I found an article about a car accident on that same stretch of highway. A couple had gone off the road during a snowstorm. They were found a few days later, both dead. The article mentioned something about strange footprints found near the scene. They never figured out what made them. Every time I drive on that highway now, I can't help but look in the rearview mirror. I haven't seen those headlights again, but the memory of that night still lingers. It's like a shadow, always just out of sight, waiting. I never considered myself a conspiracy theorist. I've always been one of those people who tries to stay grounded in reality. I mean, sure, I'd listen to friends talk about Bigfoot sightings or the moon landing being staged, and I'd laugh it off, but never really bought into that stuff. Then something happened a few years ago that made me question everything. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that there's some truth to one of the scariest conspiracy theories I've ever come across. It all started when I moved into a new apartment. Nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom place in the city. The building was old, creaky, but had character, you know? The kind of place that had stories hidden in the walls. I liked it. It was cozy. For the first couple of months, everything was fine. Work was normal, life was normal. Until the night I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was coming from outside. I lived on the third floor, and there were always people wandering the streets at night. Drunks, couples arguing, people talking loudly on their phones. But this whispering, it was different. It was too close. Like it was coming from inside my apartment. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, straining my ears to catch the words. But as soon as I sat up, the whispering stopped. I chalked it up to a weird dream and went back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was sure I wasn't dreaming. The whispers were faint but persistent, like someone was standing right outside my bedroom door. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and checked the entire apartment. Nothing. Windows were locked, door was bolted shut. No signs of anyone having been inside. I started to feel a little unsettled, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the building settling, or maybe voices from another apartment were carrying through the walls. But then things started to get weirder. One evening, I came home from work and found a piece of paper folded neatly on my coffee table. I hadn't left it there. I lived alone, and I was sure I'd locked the door behind me when I left that morning. My stomach dropped. I hesitated for a second before picking it up and unfolding it. The paper was blank, completely blank. No writing, no markings, nothing. I checked the door and windows again. All locked. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside without breaking in. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. I even considered going to a therapist, thinking maybe the stress of work was getting to me. But then, something happened that convinced me this wasn't just stress. One night, the whispering woke me up again, but this time it was louder, clearer, and I could finally make out what it was saying. "We're watching." I froze. My entire body went cold. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to figure out if I'd really heard that or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder this time. "We're watching." The voice was soft, almost robotic, like it wasn't human. I grabbed my phone and called the police, convinced that someone was messing with me, breaking into my apartment or spying on me somehow. The police came, checked everything, and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no hidden cameras, nothing. They left after an hour, reassuring me that it was probably just my imagination. But I knew what I'd heard, and it wasn't just in my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening for the whispering, but it didn't come back. Instead, my phone buzzed with a notification. I grabbed it, half relieved for a distraction, but when I looked at the screen, my relief turned to fear. It was a message from an unknown number, and all it said was, "We're watching." I dropped my phone like it had burned me. My hands were shaking. How could someone know what I'd heard? I hadn't told anyone about the whispering, not even the police. I didn't sleep at all that night. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. I'd come home to find things moved around in my apartment. Books on the shelf would be rearranged. My toothbrush would be on the counter when I knew I'd left it in the bathroom cabinet. Little things, but enough to make me feel like I was constantly being watched. The messages kept coming too. Always the same words. We're watching. Sometimes they'd come in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day while I was at work. I tried changing my phone number, but the messages still found me. I even moved out of that apartment, thinking maybe there was something wrong with the building or that someone had been spying on me there. But the messages followed me to my new place. We're watching. I started doing some research, trying to find out if anyone else had experienced something similar. That's when I stumbled upon the theory. It was buried in a forum about surveillance and government conspiracies. The theory went like this. There's a secret group, an organization, that watches people. Regular people. Not celebrities, not politicians, just ordinary, everyday people like me. They do it for reasons no one really understands. Some say it's an experiment. Others say it's a form of control, a way to keep tabs on the population. But the scariest part? The theory claims that once they start watching you, they never stop. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if I believe in shadowy organizations or secret surveillance. But after everything that's happened, I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is watching me. And no matter where I go, no matter what I do, I can't escape it. Maybe I'm just paranoid. Maybe it's all in my head. But every time I get another message, every time I hear that whisper in the night, I can't help but wonder, what if they're right? What if they're watching? I was in my late 20s when I got involved with someone who, at the time, seemed like the perfect match for me. We met through mutual friends, and I remember being completely swept off my feet. He was charming, funny, and had that kind of smile that made you forget your own name for a second. Things were really good, or at least that's what I thought at the time. The first red flag that I ignored, no, willfully overlooked, was how he started to get a little secretive about his phone. He wasn't always like that, and it wasn't immediate, so I didn't pay attention at first. When we first started dating, he'd leave his phone lying around, open, or even hand it to me to check something. But slowly, over the months, it became like this extension of him that he never put down. He started keeping it face down, even during dinner or movie nights. And if I glanced at the screen when a notification popped up, he'd shift in his seat, almost like he was nervous. I chalked it up to him needing privacy, which is normal, right? The real kicker was when he started going outside for phone calls. He used to take calls right in front of me, even FaceTime with friends or family while I was in the room. But then one evening, he got a call, looked at me and said, "I'll be right back," as he headed out to the porch. It wasn't even cold out, but the way he shut the door behind him made it feel like winter had walked into our living room. I didn't say anything that time, but it kept happening. I'd ask who it was, and he'd wave it off. "Oh, just work stuff." I work in a similar field, and his work calls usually weren't happening at 10 p.m. But again, I let it slide. He was also suddenly super into going to the gym. Now, let me preface this by saying I'm not anti-fitness. We both like working out, but he had never been one of those get up at 6 a.m. to hit the gym types. Suddenly, he was doing exactly that. At first, I thought, good for him. But when he started going twice a day, even after coming home from a long shift, it just didn't sit right. He'd come back late, shower, and then crawl into bed without much conversation. It's like he was avoiding me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. It all started clicking when he began getting overly irritable. Every little thing I did seemed to annoy him. Like one day, I texted him to ask what time he'd be home, and he snapped back with, "Why do you need to know? Are you keeping tabs on me?" And that's when I knew. He was turning the tables, making me the suspicious one, as if I was trying to control him. But the truth was I'd been feeling off for months, and that was the moment I realized something bigger was going on. Then came the distance, the emotional kind. It was like he was pulling away without physically leaving. He'd stop initiating conversations, even about basic things like our plans for the weekend. He used to be so invested in us, and suddenly he just wasn't. We'd sit on the couch, and it felt like we were miles apart, even though our knees were practically touching. But the day I knew for sure was when he didn't come home at all one night. He told me he was going out with friends, which wasn't out of the ordinary. But the clock hit midnight, then 2 a.m., and there was still no sign of him. I texted him, no response. I called, and it went straight to voicemail. When he finally walked through the door at 7 in the morning, looking disheveled and tired, he tried to pass it off as we just crashed at a buddy's house. No apology, no explanation that made any sense. I confronted him, asked if he was seeing someone else. He got defensive, of course, and accused me of being paranoid. Told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. But here's the thing, I wasn't paranoid. I had a gut feeling, that heavy pit in my stomach that doesn't let you sleep at night. And I trusted it. It wasn't long after that when I found out the truth. I'm embarrassed to admit this part, but one night, I went through his phone while he was in the shower. I'm not proud of it, but honestly, I don't regret it either. I found text messages, and it was clear as day. He had been seeing someone else for months. He didn't even bother to delete the messages. The worst part? It was someone I knew, an old friend of his who I had met several times. She'd been at our apartment before. I remember thinking back to when I caught her giving him a look one time and feeling a little uncomfortable, but brushing it off. Turns out I should have listened to my gut back then. When I confronted him with the messages, he didn't even deny it. He just stood there, staring at me like a deer in headlights. I was ready for him to make excuses, to beg for forgiveness. But instead, he just shrugged and said, "It's been over for a while, hasn't it?" Like he had already moved on, and I was the last to know. We broke up that night. I packed a bag, went to a friend's house, and didn't look back. It took me a while to heal from that relationship, but looking back, all the signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. I was too caught up in what we used to have, not realizing that he had already checked out and was living a double life while I was still holding on. If I learned anything from that experience, it's that your gut is almost always right. If something feels off, it probably is. People don't just start acting out of character for no reason. And if someone's hiding their phone like it holds the nuclear codes or starts going to the gym at all hours of the night after never caring about it before, yeah, you might want to start asking some questions. In the end, I'm grateful I found out when I did. I didn't waste any more time on someone who wasn't worth it. And now, I'm in a much better place, with someone who doesn't make me second-guess everything. But man, those months of slowly realizing I was being lied to were some of the hardest times of my life. You always think you'll know, that you'd never be one of those people who gets cheated on. But when you're in it, denial is a powerful thing. Trust your instincts, because they're usually trying to tell you something you're not ready to hear yet. I never thought one tiny, seemingly harmless habit could almost take me out in seconds. But here I am, alive to tell you about the time I almost died because of, brace yourself, a toothpick. Yeah, a friggin' toothpick. So, this was a couple of years ago. I was working from home, stress-eating my way through a ridiculous project, trying to meet this insane deadline. When I get stressed, I have this habit of chewing on things. Pins, bottle caps, straws, you name it. That day, I happened to have one of those little wooden toothpicks in my mouth, and I was gnawing on it absent-mindedly while typing away on my laptop. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Wrong. Now, I don't know exactly how it happened, but at some point while I was trying to manage a conference call, the toothpick slipped from my teeth and suddenly, poof, it was gone. Like 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. I sat there for a second, confused, before I realized I'd swallowed it. The panic didn't hit immediately. My first thought was something like, it's just a toothpick. It'll pass. I even chuckled to myself because swallowing a toothpick? Who does that? I tried to brush it off like it was no big deal. People accidentally swallow things all the time, right? But then I felt it, that sharp, stabbing feeling in my throat, like someone had jammed a needle down my esophagus. I tried to cough it up, but no luck. I drank water, still stuck. At this point, I'm thinking, okay, this isn't great, but I'll be fine. So I did what any smart, capable adult would do. I Googled it. Big mistake. The first article I found was titled something like, "Swallowed a Toothpick? Here's why you should go to the ER immediately." That's when I learned that toothpicks are no joke. Apparently, they don't just pass through your system like you'd expect. They can puncture your intestines, tear through organs, and cause internal bleeding or infection. And the worst part? If it perforates something, you could be dead within hours or even minutes. At this point, my anxiety was through the roof. I was sitting at my desk, clutching my throat, trying to decide if I should call an ambulance or wait it out. I called my friend instead. You know how you always have that one friend who stays calm no matter what? Yeah, that's not who I called. I called my most dramatic friend, and as soon as I told him, he was like, "Dude, you're gonna die. You need to get to the ER now." Great. Thanks for the reassurance. I'm now fully panicking, trying to imagine this little sliver of wood tearing up my insides. My throat still hurts, and I'm convinced I'm moments away from keeling over. So, I drove myself to the emergency room. Probably not the best idea given my state of mind, but I didn't want to waste time waiting for an ambulance. When I got to the ER, I practically burst through the doors, explaining to the receptionist that I'd swallowed a toothpick and needed help immediately. To her credit, she didn't laugh at me, though I could see the hint of a smile. They took me back pretty quickly, and after what felt like forever, the doctor finally came to check me out. He looked down my throat and ran some tests. By this point, I'm sweating bullets, picturing myself on a gurney with tubes everywhere, fighting for my life. After some x-rays, the doctor came back with the verdict. "Well, I don't see any immediate damage, but we're going to monitor you for a bit." Not exactly reassuring. They kept me under observation for a few hours, but I was still in that mental space where I'm convinced I'm going to be one of those bizarre medical cases you read about. You know, man dies after swallowing toothpick in freak accident. My life flashing before my eyes over a toothpick, for crying out loud. Thankfully, I eventually got the all clear. The toothpick, according to the doctor, had likely passed through my throat without doing serious damage, but they warned me to keep an eye out for signs of internal bleeding. Yeah, no pressure. Just casually on the lookout for a sudden, excruciating death. I left the ER feeling a mix of relief and ridiculousness. I mean, seriously, a toothpick? But here's the kicker. When I told some people about it later, I found out this isn't as rare as you'd think. Apparently, plenty of people have ended up in the hospital, and even the morgue, because of accidentally swallowing sharp objects like toothpicks or fish bones. It's not something you think about, but it happens. Now, I'm a lot more careful with what I put in my mouth when I'm stressed. No more chewing on random things while I work, and I'm never touching another toothpick again. It's funny how something so small and seemingly harmless can take you out just like that. It really makes you realize how fragile we all are. I still joke with my friends that I almost became a cautionary tale. The guy who died because he couldn't resist chewing on a toothpick. But in all seriousness, it was one of the scariest moments of my life. And it opened my eyes to how quickly things can go wrong. You always think it'll be some huge, obvious danger that'll get you, a car accident, a fall, maybe a wild animal, but sometimes it's the smallest, most ordinary thing that can kill you in seconds. So yeah, my advice? Don't chew on random stuff, especially sharp objects, and maybe take a little extra care with the things you think are totally harmless. It's the everyday things you never see coming that might just surprise you, in the worst way. I've been faking a phobia for almost 10 years. I didn't plan for it to get this far. It just kind of snowballed. It started off as a small white lie, and now it's so big that I'm not even sure how to back out without everyone thinking I'm completely insane. Let me explain. When I was in college, I started dating this girl who was really into psychology. She was always talking about phobias, anxieties, weird little quirks people had, and I thought it was fascinating. One day, we were having this conversation about irrational fears, and I just blurted out, "Oh yeah, I'm deathly afraid of clowns." I have no idea why I said it. It just came out. I didn't have a problem with clowns at all, but in that moment, I guess I just wanted to be part of the conversation. She was super into it, really into it. She started asking me all these questions. When did it start? How bad was it? Did I ever try exposure therapy? And instead of admitting that I'd made it up, I just rolled with it. I made up this elaborate story about how, when I was a kid, a clown at a birthday party scared the hell out of me. And ever since then, I'd been freaked out by them. It seemed harmless at the time. I mean, who's going to test you on your fear of clowns, right? Well, it didn't stop there. She told her friends about it, and then her family. So every time we were at her parents' house or hanging out with her group of friends, they would avoid anything even remotely clown-related. Like one time, her friend wanted to watch it, and she shut it down immediately, saying, "Oh no, we can't. He's terrified of clowns." I remember just sitting there, nodding along, feeling like a complete idiot, but not knowing how to correct it without looking like a liar. Fast forward a couple of years, and we broke up, not because of the clown thing, thankfully, but by that point, The fake phobia had become a part of my life. I never really thought I'd have to keep it up once we split, but somehow it followed me. Mutual friends, family members, it spread. People just knew me as the guy who's scared of clowns. It became one of my defining traits. At one point, I even started doing the whole fake anxiety act. Like if I saw a clown on TV, I'd wince or turn away to make it believable. Then, things got more complicated. A few years later, I started dating someone new, and, you guessed it, she heard about the clown thing. One of her friends brought it up during a group dinner, and she turned to me like, "Wait, is that true? You're scared of clowns?" By this point, I was in too deep. I nodded, told the same old story about the birthday party, and like clockwork, she was super sympathetic about it. She even said it was cute, which was weird, but whatever. I figured it'd just be one of those things I never had to deal with again. Boy, was I wrong. A year into our relationship, her younger brother was planning this big Halloween party, and guess what? He thought it would be hilarious to have a bunch of people dress up as clowns just to scare me. I found out about this in advance because her brother was terrible at keeping secrets, but I couldn't back out. I couldn't admit that it was all a lie. I mean, how you say, "Hey guys, funny story, I've actually never been scared of clowns." I made the whole thing up years ago because I didn't know how to make conversation. Yeah, that would have gone over real well. So I had to go to this party, knowing that at least a dozen people would be dressed as clowns, all waiting to see me freak out. I spent the entire car ride there psyching myself up, thinking, okay, just fake a panic attack or something. Make it believable, and then you can leave early. The moment I walked into the party, they sprang the surprise. Clowns everywhere. I'm talking full makeup, wigs, rubber noses, the works. They were laughing and pointing, waiting for my reaction. My girlfriend was watching me closely, like she was ready to comfort me if I broke down. My heart was racing, not because I was scared of the clowns, but because I had no idea how to sell this. I could feel the sweat dripping down my back as I tried to think of what to do. So I just went for it. I faked a full-on meltdown. I stumbled backward, started breathing heavily, and even let out a half cry, half scream. I'll admit, I may have overdone it because people started panicking. My girlfriend grabbed my arm and tried to calm me down, and her brother looked like he was about to throw up from guilt. I think someone even mentioned calling an ambulance. It was chaos. Eventually, I calmed down enough for her to take me home. On the drive back, she kept apologizing, saying she had no idea her brother would take it that far. I felt awful. I mean, this girl thought she just traumatized me for life, and I couldn't even come clean about it. I just nodded and told her it was okay, that I just needed some space. That was 2 years ago. We're still together, and she's still super protective of me when it comes to anything clown-related. If there's a clown in a commercial or in a movie trailer, she'll grab the remote and change the channel without even thinking about it. I hate it. I hate that this stupid lie has followed me for so long, but at this point, I have no idea how to fix it. I've built up this whole persona around something that isn't even real, and it's exhausting. I feel like a fraud every time I have to pretend to be scared, but if I admit the truth now, everyone's going to think I'm crazy, or worse, a liar. I guess I am a liar, but not the malicious kind. Just the kind who didn't know how to get out of a dumb mistake and let it spiral out of control. So yeah, that's my secret. I'm a grown man pretending to be scared of clowns for no reason other than I'm too much of a coward to admit I lied 10 years ago. So, I guess it's story time. My first day in the industry was a wild mix of terror, awkwardness, and surprising clarity all wrapped into one. I didn't plan to get into this work. I didn't even think it was something people like me did. You know, the whole that only happens in movies or on TV mindset. But then reality hits you when you're scraping by with rent due in 2 days and no viable options in sight. I just turned 23 and was working part-time at a coffee shop. The pay sucked. I had student loans up to my ears, and my life felt like it was teetering on the edge of something I didn't want to face. I started scrolling through job ads, desperate for a way out, and stumbled on an ad for dancers wanted at this local strip club. It was vague, but I clicked on it. I figured, why not? At least go in and see what it's about. I didn't tell anyone, no friends, no family. I wasn't sure what I was doing myself, so why get them involved? The interview process was nothing like I expected. I walked in, nervous as hell, and the club manager, This middle-aged woman with a deep smoker's voice barely looked up from her clipboard. She said, "Take your clothes off," like it was the most normal thing in the world. My heart was pounding, but I guess something inside me snapped like, okay, this is it, I'm already here. Just do it. I stripped down to my underwear, trying not to shake too much. She barely glanced up from her paperwork, nodded, and said, "You start tomorrow. Bring heels. No stilettos, those are for pros." I left the club that day feeling both empowered and sick to my stomach at the same time. I went straight to Marshall's to buy a pair of heels, something semi-sexy, but not too much, you know? I spent like $30, which was way more than I had budgeted for, but I convinced myself it was an investment. It was still all so surreal. The next day, I showed up for my first shift. I'm not gonna lie, I was shaking so hard I thought my knees would give out. The other girls barely acknowledged me, which made it worse. I was the new girl, and they were definitely sizing me up, deciding whether I'd make it or not. It didn't help that they all looked like they'd been doing this for years. Perfect hair, makeup on point, and the kind of confidence you could feel as soon as they walked by. My first stage performance? Disaster. Absolute disaster. I watched the girl before me. Let's call her Sasha. She was incredible. Flawless. The way she moved, you could tell she had control over the entire room. People were throwing money at her like she was a goddess. Meanwhile, I'm standing in the wings in my cheap heels, sweating, and telling myself not to faint. Then it was my turn. I wish I could say I stepped out there, owned it, and felt sexy and empowered like you see in movies. No, I walked up to that pole, grabbed it, and immediately almost fell on my ass. The heels were the wrong size, my hands were sweaty, and I was so focused on not embarrassing myself that I completely forgot to, actually dance. I just stood there, awkwardly swaying side to side, holding on to that pole for dear life. Some guy in the front row was waving a dollar bill at me, and I had no idea what to do with it. Like, do I just grab it? Do I have to do something sexy first? My brain was not cooperating. Then the worst thing happened. Some drunk guy yells out, "Show us what you got, baby," and the room roared with laughter. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I somehow finished my dance, scurried off stage, and went straight to the dressing room. I didn't cry, but I came close. I just sat there, staring at myself in the mirror, thinking, what the hell did I just do? One of the other girls, her name was Mia, I think, came over and gave me a cigarette. I don't even smoke, but I took it just to do something with my hands. She sat down next to me and said, "Don't sweat it. Everyone's first time sucks. You'll get the hang of it." I appreciated her saying that, but I didn't believe her. I thought I'd made a huge mistake. The rest of the night wasn't any better. I made $40 in tips, and I'm pretty sure one of the guys thought he was paying me out of pity. I didn't know how to interact with customers, didn't know how to sell a lap dance, and definitely didn't know how to fake confidence. But for some reason, when the night ended and I was walking home, I didn't feel defeated. I felt weirdly determined, like, okay, you suck tonight, but you can get better at this. I don't know where that mindset came from. Maybe it was sheer desperation, or maybe there was something about the job that intrigued me despite everything. So I went back the next night, and the night after that. Slowly, I started getting better. I watched the pros, learned how to move without tripping over my own feet, learned how to flirt without sounding like a complete idiot. The money wasn't great at first, but it started adding up. A couple months in, I had regulars who'd come to see me. They weren't creepy or gross like I expected. Most of them just wanted someone to talk to, someone who'd make them feel special for a few minutes. I wasn't just shaking my ass for cash. I was playing a role, giving them an escape from whatever life they had outside those club walls. And in a weird way, that gave me some confidence. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There were nights when I felt gross, nights when a guy would say something degrading and I'd have to just smile through it. But there were also nights when I walked out with $500 in my pocket and felt like I was on top of the world. It was a roller coaster of emotions, but I rode it for almost 2 years before I decided to get out. Looking back, that first night was a disaster, but it was also the beginning of something that helped me grow. I learned more about myself in those 2 years than I ever did working at the coffee shop. I learned how to handle myself in tough situations, how to read people, and how to set boundaries, even in a world where boundaries can feel blurry. It wasn't what I thought I'd be doing at 23, but in some strange way, I don't regret it. It gave me the financial freedom to get out of debt and the emotional strength to take on whatever comes next. And that's how my accidental career in the adult entertainment industry began. I went to a pretty laid-back high school where nothing too crazy ever happened, at least on the surface. But there was one event during my junior year that no one ever saw coming, and it turned our school upside down. It started with the dumbest prank, which somehow spiraled into one of the wildest things I've ever witnessed. I still think about it sometimes, and it's just surreal that it all happened so fast. So, there was this kid, let's call him Tommy. Tommy was one of those guys who always tried way too hard to get attention. He wasn't popular, but he wasn't a total loser either. Just kind of floated in between, doing dumb stuff to make people laugh or cringe. He was the kind of guy who'd run up behind you, slap your books out of your hands, and run away laughing like it was the funniest thing in the world. Anyway, Tommy had this genius idea to pull a prank involving a dead raccoon. Yeah, you read that right. A dead raccoon. Apparently, Tommy had found it on the side of the road on his way to school one morning and thought it would be hilarious to bring it in. How he managed to sneak the thing into school is beyond me, but he did. And not just into the school, he somehow got it into the cafeteria without anyone noticing. The plan, if you could call it that, was to toss the raccoon onto the stage during lunchtime, right when everyone was eating. Classic, right? So, it's a normal day, everyone's sitting around eating pizza or whatever, and out of nowhere, Tommy lobs this dead raccoon onto the stage like a grenade. It lands with this nasty thud right in front of the lunch lady who's setting up for some talent show rehearsal. The whole cafeteria goes silent for a second, and then this one kid, Chris, lets out the most ridiculous scream I've ever heard, like someone had just stabbed him. That set off the chain reaction. People started freaking out. Some kids bolted for the doors. Others stood on their chairs like they were trying to escape a flood. A few of the football guys started laughing their asses off, like it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. But the lunch lady? She fainted, straight up passed out on the stage, right next to the dead raccoon. The assistant principal, Mr. Michaels, rushed over, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, but he slipped in something, I think it was some spilled milk, and fell right on his back. It was absolute chaos. Now, at this point, most normal schools would have just sent everyone back to class, called animal control, and that would have been the end of it. But not my school. Things took a turn when Tommy, probably high on the attention he was getting, decided he wasn't done with his raccoon prank. While everyone was still freaking out, he runs back onto the stage, grabs the raccoon by the tail, and starts swinging it around like some deranged cowboy. I kid you not, he was spinning it in circles above his head, making these weird whooping noises, and everyone just froze. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. And then it happened. The raccoon came loose from Tommy's grip and went flying, straight into the ceiling fan. I swear, the moment it hit, the cafeteria went silent again. There was this sickening crunch, and then, splat. The raccoon basically exploded, and chunks of it went everywhere. Like we're talking fur, guts, and God knows what else just raining down on everyone in the cafeteria. I'll never forget the sound of it hitting the tables. It was like a scene from a horror movie, but worse because it was real, and we were all covered in dead raccoon debris. At this point, kids were puking, screaming, and running out of the cafeteria like their lives depended on it. I remember one girl, Megan, sitting there in shock with a piece of raccoon tail hanging off her ponytail. She didn't even notice it at first, which made it all the more horrifying when she did. I could see the exact moment she felt it, and her face turned pale, followed by the loudest shriek I've ever heard. People still talk about that scream. The administration, of course, lost their minds. They called the cops, the fire department, the health department, basically every authority they could think of. The school went into lockdown, not because there was an actual threat, but because nobody knew what to do about the biohazard mess Tommy had just unleashed. I remember sitting in the gym for what felt like hours while hazmat suits cleared the cafeteria like it was a crime scene. Tommy? Well, he got expelled, obviously. The funny thing is, he didn't even look that upset about it. As they were dragging him out of the school, he had this dumb grin on his face like he'd just won the lottery. I guess in his mind, going down in history as the kid who blew up a raccoon with a ceiling fan was worth it. The rest of us had to live with the aftermath. The cafeteria smelled awful for weeks, no matter how many times they cleaned it. There were rumors that bits of raccoon were still stuck in the fan, but I don't know if that's true. I wouldn't be surprised though. The story spread fast too. Within a few days, everyone in town knew about the raccoon incident. We had news crews outside the school, parents losing their minds, and endless jokes flying around. Some kids even made t-shirts that said, "I survived the raccoon apocalypse," which got banned, of course, but that didn't stop anyone from wearing them. To this day, it's the thing everyone brings up at reunions. It's like the one defining event of our entire high school experience. Looking back, it's hard to believe that it all started because Tommy thought it'd be funny to throw a dead raccoon on stage. I mean, who even thinks of that? But that's high school for you. One dumb idea can turn into a legendary disaster in the blink of an eye. Anyway, that's my wild high school story. Definitely not something I'll ever forget, no matter how hard I try. I never thought I'd be that guy, you know? The one with the weird, taboo story you'd only hear about in a drunken game of Never Have I Ever or something. But here I am, sharing it anonymously on the internet, because maybe getting it out will help me process how it all happened. So, let me set the scene. I was 22, fresh out of college, and had just started my first real job. My best friend, Jake, and I had been close since high school. Same football team, same dumb inside jokes, basically brothers. I'd spent more time at his place than my own growing up, and his mom, Carol, had always been, well, around. She was one of those moms everyone thought was attractive, but in that suburban soccer mom way. I'd always thought of her as Jake's mom, not like a person with a life of her own, if that makes sense. Fast forward to Jake moving out of state for work. I stayed local, and his mom and I kept in touch here and there, mostly through Jake, who was terrible at staying in contact. I'd help her with stuff around the house sometimes, yard work, fixing things Jake used to handle before he moved. It was casual, normal. But then one night it wasn't. It was around Thanksgiving, and Jake had flown in to visit family. I went over to his mom's house to catch up with him. We had some beers, laughed, played video games like we used to. At some point, Jake passed out on the couch, typical, and I was about to head home when Carol came into the living room with a bottle of wine and asked if I wanted to stay and talk for a bit. I figured why not? After all, I hadn't seen her in a while either, and I didn't want to just dip without saying goodbye. We sat in the kitchen, talking about life, jobs, relationships, the usual. She opened up about how hard it was adjusting to life without Jake around, especially with her being newly single. Her divorce had finalized not long before Jake moved, and though I knew about it, I never thought much of it. It just hadn't seemed relevant to me, you know? But that night, she seemed lonely in a way I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I just hadn't been paying attention. At some point, she poured us both another glass of wine, and there was this shift. I don't know how to explain it. The conversation turned a little more personal. She talked about feeling undesirable after the divorce, how dating at her age felt impossible. I tried to lighten the mood, joking that she had nothing to worry about because, honestly, Carol was attractive. But then she looked at me, really looked at me in a way that made me pause. "You really think that?" she asked, her voice softer, almost shy. I laughed it off at first, but then she reached across the table and touched my hand. Not in a casual, friendly way, but something different, something that made my brain short-circuit for a second. Before I could really process what was happening, she leaned in and kissed me. And I didn't pull away. Looking back, I should have. I know I should have. But in that moment, with the wine in my system and the years of familiarity between us, it didn't feel wrong. It felt surprising. Like, how had I never seen her this way before? She was beautiful, confident, and there was this tension in the air that felt impossible to ignore. So, I kissed her back. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were stumbling into her bedroom. It was surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body, thinking, is this really happening? But it was happening, and honestly, it was amazing. There was this weird, electric chemistry between us, something I never would have imagined. But in that moment, it felt like we both wanted it for a long time without even knowing. The next morning, I woke up in her bed and reality hit me like a truck. Jake, my best friend. I just slept with his mom. My stomach churned, and I bolted out of there before she even woke up with some half-assed excuse about needing to run errands. I spent the next few days freaking out. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about her. The guilt was there, but so was the memory of how good it had felt, how right it had seemed in the moment. I didn't know what to do. I considered telling Jake, but what the hell would I say? Hey man, I know you're my best friend, but I just slept with your mom. No hard feelings, right? Yeah, no. I avoided her calls for a while after that. But then she showed up at my apartment one night, unannounced, looking as gorgeous as ever. I tried to play it cool, acting like everything was fine, but she could tell I was spiraling. Look, she said, sitting on my couch with this calm, confident expression, I'm not expecting anything. It happened and it was amazing. But if you're not okay with it, we can pretend it didn't. That's the thing about Carol. She always knew how to put me at ease. So, against my better judgment, we ended up seeing each other again. And again, what started as a one-time thing became this situation. She'd come over to my place once a week, sometimes more, and we'd just be together. It wasn't just about the sex, though that was obviously a huge part of it. It was like we filled this weird void for each other. Her loneliness, my confusion about life after college. But the guilt? It never fully went away. Every time I hung out with Jake, I felt like a piece of shit. He'd talk about how glad he was that I was still helping his mom out. How he didn't worry about her being alone, because she had me to keep her company. And the whole time, I'd be sitting there, nodding along, knowing I was betraying him in the worst way. This went on for almost a year. A year. I don't even know how we kept it from Jake for so long, but eventually it ended. Not in some dramatic blow-up or anything. I just couldn't do it anymore. The guilt was eating me alive, and I could tell Carol was starting to feel it too. So one day, I told her we needed to stop. She agreed, and that was that. We haven't spoken since. Jake never found out, and part of me is grateful for that, but another part of me feels like I'll always carry this secret with me. I still think about her sometimes, how it all felt so forbidden and wrong, but also right in some twisted way. But mostly I try to push it down and move on, because that's all you can really do, right? Anyway, that's my story. I know it's messed up, and I'm definitely not proud of it. But there it is. When I was around 14, I went on a camping trip with my dad, my uncle, and my cousin. This was in the mountains of West Virginia, and we were way off the beaten path, like the closest store was 30 miles away, kind of off the beaten path. My dad loved the idea of roughing it, so we didn't even have proper tents, just some old tarps tied between trees. I loved those trips when I was younger, but this one, I'll never forget it, and I haven't been camping since. We'd been there for a couple of days, hiking, fishing, doing all the usual camping stuff, when on the third night something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but I had this gnawing feeling in my stomach the whole evening. I brushed it off, thinking I was just nervous about a storm my uncle said might roll in. Around 10 p.m., we all crawled into our sleeping bags under the tarps, and the forest was quiet, almost too quiet. That's when I started hearing noises. At first, it was just a couple of twigs snapping in the distance. I didn't think much of it. Could have been a deer or something. But then the sounds got closer, like someone or something was creeping around just beyond the tree line. I sat up and looked over at my cousin, who was wide awake too. I whispered, "Do you hear that?" He nodded, eyes wide, but we didn't want to wake up my dad or uncle because, honestly, they would have probably just told us to stop being babies. We lay back down, trying to ignore it, but the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. It wasn't just twigs snapping anymore. It sounded like something big was moving through the woods, but it never came close enough for us to see. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to my cousin shaking me. His face was pale as a ghost, and before I could ask what was wrong, I heard it too, a low, guttural growl, deep and raspy, coming from the direction of the creek near our camp. The kind of sound that makes every hair on your body stand straight up. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a deer, and it wasn't small. My heart started racing, and without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight next to my sleeping bag and flicked it on. Big mistake. The second the beam cut through the dark, I caught a glimpse of something huge, just for a split second before it darted back into the trees. I couldn't even process what I saw, but it was tall like a person, but hunched over, and it moved fast, too fast. I sat there frozen, listening as the growling came closer. My cousin whispered, "What the hell was that?" But I didn't have an answer. We were both too scared to move, too scared to breathe. Then, out of nowhere, my dad shot up from his sleeping bag, his flashlight in hand, and barked, "Everyone up now!" The urgency in his voice scared the crap out of me. He wasn't the type to panic, but he looked terrified. My uncle was already up, grabbing his rifle, which, until that moment, had stayed untouched the whole trip. We all huddled together and my dad whispered, "We need to go. Now!" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it had that edge to it that told me something was really wrong. My cousin and I didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed what little we could, basically just our shoes, and started heading back toward the trail we'd hiked in on. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting that thing, whatever it was, to come charging out of the trees. We made it about 100 yards from camp when we heard it again, the growling. Louder this time, closer, like it was following us. My uncle stopped dead in his tracks and raised the rifle. My dad whispered something to him, but I didn't catch it because I was too busy trying not to lose it. We stood there in the dark, listening. It felt like an eternity. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps coming toward us fast. My dad grabbed me by the arm and said, "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. My cousin and I bolted, running as fast as we could down the trail. I could hear my dad and uncle behind us, but I didn't dare look back. The whole time, I felt like whatever was out there was right behind us, just out of sight. We didn't stop running until we got back to the truck, which was parked at the trailhead, about 2 miles from where we'd set up camp. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. When we finally made it, I collapsed against the side of the truck, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad and uncle weren't far behind, and they looked just as shaken as we were. Without a word, my dad unlocked the truck and we all piled in. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I looked back down the trail, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back in town. We ended up crashing at a cheap motel for the night, and no one said a word about what happened until the next morning. Over breakfast, my dad finally spoke up. "I don't know what that thing was, but we're never going back to that spot again." And we didn't. We haven't been camping at all since then. My dad's never been one to talk about feelings or anything like that, but every now and then, when camping comes up, I can see that look in his eyes, the same look he had that night. Whatever was out there, it scared him in a way I've never seen before. And that, more than anything, is what really haunts me. It's been years since that night, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear that growling. I'll never forget the time I thought I was about to lose my best friend. It's one of those moments where time seems to stretch out and everything slows down, but your mind is racing with a million thoughts. It was about 4 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. We were hiking in the mountains, a group of 6 of us who had known each other since college. It was a beautiful, clear autumn day, the kind where the air is crisp but the sun's warm enough to make you sweat. The trail wasn't one of those well-maintained, family-friendly ones. It was steep and rocky, winding up through the woods and hugging the side of a cliff for a good portion of the hike. I'm not exaggerating when I say that a wrong step could send you tumbling down into the abyss below. We were all pretty experienced hikers and none of us were too worried. That day, though, one of my best friends, Mike, had been acting a little off. I figured he was just tired from the night before. We'd stayed up late drinking and playing cards at the cabin we'd rented. He hadn't been feeling great, but he insisted he was fine, so we kept going. We'd been climbing for about 3 hours when we reached this section of the trail that had a narrow ledge. On one side was the rock face, and on the other was a sheer drop. I'd say it was maybe 100 feet down, and there were just trees and jagged rocks below. It was the kind of place that makes you nervous, even if you've done it before. Mike was ahead of me, and I noticed he was moving slower than usual. I called out to ask if he was all right, and he gave me a thumbs up, but his face was pale. I should have known something was wrong right then, but I didn't push it. I figured he'd just had too much to drink the night before, or maybe he hadn't eaten enough. I kept my distance to give him space. Then it happened. Mike stumbled. It wasn't dramatic at first. It looked like he just lost his footing, but we were on that narrow ledge. I saw his foot slip off the edge, and for a split second, he teetered there, arms flailing. It was like the universe held its breath. I remember this strange, calm thought entering my mind. This is how it happens. He's going to fall. And then he did. Time froze. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, sliding down the side of the cliff trying to grab onto anything. I just stood there, paralyzed. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I don't think I even screamed at first. I scrambled to the edge of the trail and looked over. Mike had managed to grab onto a thin tree branch sticking out of the cliff about 15 feet below, but it didn't look like it could hold him for long. His legs were dangling in the air, and there was nothing but rocks and empty space beneath him. I could hear him shouting my name, his voice high-pitched with panic, and that's when the fear hit me like a freight train. I didn't know what to do. I mean, how do you react to something like that? My mind was racing through 1,000 different scenarios, most of them ending with him falling, and well, but somehow I shoved all that panic down and yelled for the others. By the time they caught up, Mike was still hanging on, but I could see the branch was bending, and it was only a matter of time before it snapped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to explode in my chest. One of our friends, James, had some climbing experience, and he quickly rigged up a rope with what little gear we had. It wasn't much, but it was our only option. I've never seen someone work as fast as James did that day. I don't think he even thought about what he was doing. He just moved on instinct. We all grabbed onto the rope, creating a human anchor, while James climbed down as carefully as he could. I couldn't breathe the whole time. I was just staring at that thin branch, waiting for it to snap, praying that it would hold. When James finally reached Mike, I could see Mike's hand slipping. His face was beet red, and he was shaking from the effort of holding on. I remember shouting, "Hold on, Mike. Just a little longer." I don't even know if he heard me. James reached him just in time. I saw him grab Mike's wrist, and for a second, I thought they were both going to go over. But James managed to get the rope around Mike and secure him. Inch by inch, we pulled them both back up. When Mike finally made it back on a solid ground, he collapsed. He was gasping for air, his face pale and his body trembling. I dropped down next to him, my own hands shaking uncontrollably. We didn't say anything for a long time. There was just the sound of our ragged breathing and the wind whistling through the trees. I think we were all in shock. Eventually, Mike looked up at me and gave this weak little laugh. "Guess I'm buying the beers tonight," he said, his voice shaky. It was such a ridiculous thing to say after what had just happened, but we all burst out laughing, more from relief than anything else. I think we were just happy that he was still alive. The rest of the hike back down was tense. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew how close we'd come to losing him. Every step felt like it could have been our last, even though we were on solid ground. I kept glancing over at Mike, half expecting him to just disappear again. I think it took hours for the adrenaline to wear off. That night, back at the cabin, we all sat around the fire, drinking and not really talking about what had happened. We didn't need to. It was one of those things you don't forget, but you also don't want to dwell on. Mike kept cracking jokes about how he'd never live it down, but I could see in his eyes that he was still shaken. I think about that day more often than I'd like to admit. It's one of those experiences that sticks with you, reminding you how fragile everything is. One wrong step, and everything could be over. I don't know if Mike fully realized how close he came to dying that day, but I sure did. And every time I hike now, I make damn sure to check my footing. For the last 8 years, I've been lying to my entire family about what I do for a living. My parents, my siblings, even my friends think I work at this big, successful law firm downtown. Every time they ask about my day, I rattle off the same old stories about client meetings, briefs, deadlines, all the legal mumbo-jumbo you hear on TV. I even wear a suit and carry a briefcase to family dinners or holidays. What they don't know is I never made it past the first year of law school. Yeah, I dropped out. Completely. I couldn't handle the pressure. It wasn't like the movies where the underdog grinds hard and comes out on top. No, it was sleepless nights, crushing anxiety, and a feeling that I was drowning every single day. By midterms, I was barely passing. By the end of the semester, I was totally checked out. I stopped going to class, skipped exams, and didn't even tell my parents. It wasn't until they asked how law school was going over Christmas that I panicked and lied, telling them everything was fine, that I was acing my finals. I don't know why I said it, but after that, the lie just stuck. I dropped out that January. I didn't tell a soul. I kept up the act, though, pretending I was still going to school, studying at cafes or libraries during the day when I should have been in class. When graduation time came, I faked it. I actually bought a cap and gown online, staged some photos, and posted them on Facebook. My family was so proud. They threw me a party, got me a fancy pen set with my initials engraved, and made me a little scrapbook of my accomplishments. I wanted to tell them so badly that it was all a sham, but I just couldn't. I saw how proud they were, and I felt trapped. So I did what any panicked idiot would do. I made up a job. I told them I'd been hired by a prestigious firm downtown right after graduation. For years now, I've been living this double life. They think I'm a lawyer who's working her way up, but in reality, I'm a bartender at this dive bar across town. I spend my days slinging drinks for college kids and tired regulars. Honestly, I like the job. It's straightforward, no bullshit. People get drunk, I listen to their problems, and then they leave. Some nights, I even get to kick out a rowdy group and feel like a badass. But it's a far cry from what my family thinks I do. The crazy part? I'm making decent money. Between tips and my side hustle managing the bar social media, I actually do all right. But it's not the kind of job you can flaunt around your parents, especially when they have this whole image of you in their heads as this accomplished, polished attorney. Every time we have a family gathering, I feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of my own lie. They ask me how work is going, and I make up stories about fake clients, pretend to gripe about office politics, throw in legal jargon I barely remember from my short stint in law school. It's exhausting, but somehow I've kept it going. The closest I've ever come to being caught was a couple of years ago. My mom was visiting the city and wanted to have lunch with me near my office. Panic set in immediately. I couldn't exactly take her to the bar where I worked. I mean, it's not exactly the kind of place you take your mom to, you know? So I rented out one of those shared office spaces for the day, dressed up in a fancy blouse, and led her to a random conference room. I gave her a little tour, made up some bullshit about it being my satellite office, and then we had lunch at this overpriced deli around the corner. I've never been so relieved to get through a meal in my life. It's gotten to the point where I'm terrified to date, because how the hell do you explain this to someone? Oh, by the way, I've been lying to everyone for almost a decade about being a lawyer. I've had a couple of relationships fizzle out because I couldn't bring myself to be honest. It's so ingrained in me now that I'm not even sure how to come clean. Part of me wants to just disappear, move to another city, and start fresh, but I'd feel like an even bigger coward if I did that. I wish I had the guts to just sit my family down and tell them the truth. I really do. But every time I imagine the look on my parents' faces, the disappointment, the betrayal, I can't bring myself to do it. I think about how proud they are of me, how they brag to their friends about their successful lawyer daughter, and the guilt just crushes me. I wonder if there's ever going to be a breaking point. If one day I'll slip up and everything will come crashing down. Maybe that's what I deserve at this point, a big, dramatic reveal where the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. But for now, I'm stuck in this lie of my own making. I feel like I'm living someone else's life half the time, and it's exhausting. I know I'll have to face the truth eventually. I just don't know how or when. But until then, I'll keep wearing the suit, telling the stories, and pretending to be someone I'm not. You ever been hiking and think, I'm just out here enjoying nature, what could possibly go wrong? Well, I've got a story that'll change the way you think about that peaceful stroll through the woods. Spoiler alert, it involves a deer. Yeah, you heard me right. Not a bear, not a wolf, a deer. Let me tell you why they're not as innocent as Bambi makes you think. So this happened a couple of years ago. I was hiking with a group of friends in this forested area about an hour from where I live. It wasn't one of those hardcore trails, more like a scenic walk through the woods. We'd been out for a few hours, nothing special, just a lot of chit-chat, the sound of birds, and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Beautiful day, sunny, clear sky, perfect for being out in nature. We felt invincible. As we're heading back to the trailhead, we see a deer up ahead. It was just standing there, nibbling on some grass, not bothered by us at all. My friend Sarah, who's got this weird obsession with taking pictures of every damn animal she sees, stops to pull out her phone. She's inching closer and closer to the deer to get a good shot. The rest of us hang back, thinking nothing of it. It's a deer. What's the worst that could happen? Maybe it runs off if it gets scared, right? Wrong. The deer lifts its head, sees Sarah getting closer, and freezes. She's now maybe 10 feet away, holding her phone out like it's a peace offering. I'm watching this, thinking Sarah's about to get the best Instagram shot of the century. But instead of bolting away like we all expected, this deer does something I'll never forget. It lowers its head and charges. Now, let me tell you, seeing a deer charge is something I never thought I'd witness. But those things can move. It covered the 10 feet between them in what felt like a split second, and before anyone could react, it rammed Sarah right in the stomach. She went flying backward, landed hard on her back, and for a second, nobody moved. We were all in shock. This is a deer, not some rabid animal from a horror movie. Sarah starts gasping for air, clutching her stomach, and the deer, instead of running off after knocking her down, is standing there over her like it's deciding whether to finish the job. We're all yelling, trying to scare it off, waving our arms and making noise. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably just a few seconds, the deer trots off into the woods like it's done nothing wrong. Like it didn't just assault one of my best friends. We rush over to Sarah. She's breathing, but barely, and she keeps saying she can't feel her legs. Now we're really freaking out because we're in the middle of the woods with no cell service, and she's clearly not okay. We manage to carry her to a clearing, and one of my other friends sprints ahead to get help. I've never felt so useless in my life, just sitting there with her, trying to keep her calm, waiting for anyone to come. Eventually, we got her airlifted out. Turns out, that innocent little deer had broken 3 of her ribs and ruptured her spleen. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and to this day, she's got a scar running across her stomach as a reminder of the time she got wrecked by a deer. So yeah, deer might seem harmless, but don't be fooled. They've got powerful legs and aren't afraid to use them if they feel threatened or cornered. I looked it up later, and apparently, deer attacks aren't as uncommon as you'd think, especially during mating season when the males are more aggressive. And that deer we ran into? Most likely a doe protecting its territory or fawns. Either way, they're not the peaceful creatures you see on TV. It's crazy how something so random can change everything in a matter of seconds. 1 minute, you're on a peaceful hike, and the next, you're calling for an airlift because your friend almost got killed by Bambi's mean cousin. It's wild to think about how fragile life really is, how one wrong move can put you in a life or death situation, even in a place as seemingly harmless as a hiking trail. And now, whenever I'm out in the woods, I keep my distance from any wildlife I come across. Deer, squirrels, birds, you name it. I've learned my lesson the hard way. Sometimes the danger isn't what you expect. It's not the big predators or the poisonous snakes you need to watch out for. Sometimes it's the animals you'd least expect, the ones you think are no threat at all, that can end you in a heartbeat. Moral of the story, respect nature. Don't get too close to wildlife, no matter how harmless they seem. You never know what's going through their minds, and it could be the last mistake you ever make.